Yo, yo, yo. What's up, Jacob? How are you? What's up, everyone? I'm playing the song that we learned the other day. I love your content, Eddie. Salute from Algeria. Wow, very cool. Not sure if I've had a viewer from Algeria before. Welcome. Do you like the movie The Battle of Algiers? Seriously, thank you. Hey, everybody. Hey, Weird Pilgrim. Welcome back. Kano831. What's up? How's it going, comrade? Hello, hello. Eddie, I'm a new son as of last week. Nice. What does that mean? I'm playing Tall Buildings right now, the song that someone showed me on stream the other day. Oh, subscriber. Gotcha. New sub as of last week. Very cool. Glad to have you with us. Got a handful of new subscribers from some of the YouTube shorts that I did that got some traction, some of the TikToks. So glad to have some new folks with us enjoying the stream. What did you think of Lee versus Ramos? That was crazy. That was one of the biggest upsets in wrestling history. Yeah, Spencer Lee's sister goes to a Division III school, actually, and I've talked to her a little bit. She's pretty nice. But I was sad. I think Spencer Lee's very, very, very injured, and that'll probably come out soon. That's what I've been hearing through the grapevine in the wrestling community. So for those who don't know, Spencer Lee was going for his 4th national title, which has only been done 5 times in history. It had only been done 4 times, and then Yanni Diakomahalis did it this weekend. And Spencer Lee was supposed to do it too, but he was quite injured, even though he had previously won nationals on 2 torn ACLs. That's how good this guy is. But he couldn't pull it off this time. He got pinned in a crazy move in the semifinals. So people are calling it the biggest upset in wrestling history. So that's what I think of Lee versus Ramos. Hey, I live in a cooperative housing complex where we all cook, clean, and do maintenance for each other, and I love it. No landlords required. That's very cool. That's very cool. I'm going to come live with you in your cooperative housing complex. Just let me set up my streaming desk. That's all I need. I'll sleep under the desk. I finished reading Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism last night, and that is 5 Marxist books I've read. Dang, you're clearing them out, Jacob. Keep going. That bookshelf is growing. I'm now currently reading Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Great book, a must-read. After that, I would read Lenin's What Is to Be Done, because there are a lot of like Lenin and Stalin books when you're going through those that you can just like rip through, read pretty fast, like you've been doing, Jacob. So yeah, What Is to Be Done goes along well with left-wing communism. This is just like practical organizing stuff. Could you or other Midwestern Marxists talk about modern monetary theory in relation to the U.S. dollar losing power? Will it affect the U.S. being able to endlessly print money? Yeah, I haven't looked into. I used to look into MMT, but it was like I was probably a junior in college, and I just didn't have the understanding of economics that I needed, or Marxist economics, to make a Marxist analysis of MMT. So I need to go back and do a deep dive into it eventually, but currently I don't know enough. But that is something I will definitely do eventually when I have the time to do that research. I have been an independent that leans right and left, but I just started educating myself on socialism after running across your shorts. I'm very interested and agree a lot with the ideology. Wow, very cool. That's so awesome to hear. Well, you came to the right place. I'm glad you're with us. Yeah, the shorts are a good way to bring people into our channel, but now that you're here for the streams and videos, we go a lot more in depth with this stuff and explain a lot of the misconceptions about socialism, because, you know, socialism is an economic ideology that if you're in the working class, it makes sense. It's just rational, right? It's alleviating the contradictions at the core of our system that lead to all these negative things like poverty and starvation and war. And socialism is the scientific analysis of the economy and understanding based on that how to move the economy away from its current contradictions, which is moving towards socialism. And there's just so many lies about, socialism is when the government just does everything. Socialism never works. Socialism always leads to dictatorship and economic collapse. So once you get through the misconceptions, it's pretty common sense stuff. I have so many questions, but I am open-minded to this. Good. That's all you need. Keep asking questions. We like to say, like Che Guevara used to say, it's not my fault that reality is Marxist. And we over here at Midwestern Marx like to say the truth is on our side. So there's nothing to hide. Like Marxism and scientific socialism aim at getting to the truth. So even if reality shows to be different than our perception of reality, we'll change our perception based on the changing reality, the changing material conditions. So, keep asking questions and trying to get to the truth. Hello, comrades. Hope you're doing well. Hello, David. My cooperative house called 21st Co-op in Austin. We have a Wikipedia page and are kind of known as hippie college students who host a lot of alternative parties in the area. We also vote on our budget and policies. That sounds pretty cool. I'm definitely coming to join. Like I'm literally Naruto running to your housing cooperative right now. Let's do it. I'll do the dishes. I'm also reading the Bolshevik Revolution 1917 through 23, Volume 1, because I saw some comrades like Akeem recommended it. In my research of him, it's a pioneer of classical realism. What is classical realism and can it be applied to Marxism? I'm not sure what classical realism is, but that sounds like a really cool book. You could also check out, when you're done with that, 10 Days That Shook the World. It's by an American journalist who was in the Soviet Union at the time of the revolution and wrote what he saw. This is really interesting. So much interesting stuff in there. If our comrade who recommended that song to me shows up in the chat, I'll have to go get my guitar and play again. Tall Buildings by Max Gomez. Working class folk song, very cool. Someone showed it to us on stream the other day and we watched it to close out the show. I'm reading Black Shirts and Reds and it's becoming one of my favorite books. Parenti equals the GOAT. Absolutely. That was the first socialist book I ever read, even before Capital. Some people know that Capital was the first theory book that I read, which was stupid on my part, but excuse me. The first book that I read that really opened me up to socialism was Black Shirts and Reds, because it debunks all the main anti-communist arguments and this idea that a lot of the post-World War II anti-communist arguments are based on, which is an idea that was supported by the CIA and expressed through thinkers like Hannah Arendt, who wrote this book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. So it's the idea that communist governments and fascist governments are essentially the same. They're equally dictatorial, whereas liberal democracies are the only governments that truly offer freedom. And, in World War II, the battle between Stalin and Hitler was pretty much a battle between equal evils, between two totalitarian countries, rather than two diametrically opposed countries, one country representing the forces and the interests of global finance capital, and the other country representing the interests of the global working class and socialist movement, which is what it actually was, which is what Parenti lays out in Black Shirts and Reds by giving a class analysis of World War II. So it's one of the best books ever. Debunks this totalitarianism nonsense, this both sides bad nonsense. Yeah, so man, y'all are totally different than what I've always been told through the media. Y'all seem like a nice, chill dude that just wants the best for everybody. I am pleasantly surprised. Well, thank you. That's what we try to be over here. You know, there's a lot of stuff like the 2019 DSA convention, and if you Google that or search it on YouTube, you'll probably know what I mean. You'll probably see what I mean. Or you'll have seen what I'm talking about. It's that convention where they were yelling at each other for clapping and saying to do this instead of clap, and talking about how there are safe rooms where people can go to escape aggressive scents. And basically, they're just like uh, saying point of privilege over and over again, and scolding other people for their mannerisms or their offensive behaviors. So they can't get anything done at all. And we try to not be like that. We try to be friendly, personable, normal, for lack of a better word, and seriously focused on, getting stuff done and accomplishing rational economic policies that will make the vast majority of American people's and globally people's lives better. That's what we're focused on. We want to build something more serious than what a lot of socialists are portrayed as in the media, and what a lot of socialist organizations have unfortunately become, partially as a result of infiltration from the ruling class and intelligence agencies. I ordered black shirts and reds and it was not correctly delivered twice. Is it tinfoil hat time? Absolutely. It was 100% intercepted by the CIA. I have no evidence for this, but it's 100% true. I'm pretty sure my copy. Yeah, this is like one of my biggest flexes, and shout out to a viewer of the show, Andy, for doing this. But my black shirts and reds copy is signed by Parenti himself. So shout out to him for that. Shout out to Christian Parenti for making that happen. Yeah, Parenti's one of my heroes. Has been since I got into leftism, pretty much. Why is the working class so blinded to their shared struggles? Well, there are a lot of reasons. It mostly amounts to bourgeois propaganda, but there's a heavy focus on identity and a heavy focus on division and keeping people polarized over political issues, religious differences, racial differences, ethnic differences, anything outside of class differences. They try and keep us divided by. And it was interesting researching Iraq, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today, but we did an Iraq deep dive recently. And the government that the U.S. tried to set up in Iraq was based on identity, religious and ethnic identity. So there were Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. So the U.S., when they toppled Saddam's government and tried to set up a new government run by essentially Iraqi exiles that supported the U.S., that the U.S. shipped into Iraq to run their country, which, sounds as ridiculous as it was. But the government that they tried to set up was based on identity. And previous to that, Iraq had had a secular state. They had had a secular government. So experts talk like people in Iraq for the first time started to learn like, oh, my neighbor is a Sunni. Oh, my neighbor is Shia. Like before, it had never been an issue. But now that these political dividing lines were drawn based on different religions and different ethnicities, that's where the different political factions started to form. And you had the emergence of these groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who then began fighting in the power vacuum that was left after Saddam was toppled. So the ruling class pushes these, identitarian ideas, identity politics that distract from any kind of class politics, because they know that the effect that it has in splintering the working class and polarizing them. There's so many more chill people out there than it may seem at first. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's absolutely like psyops within the socialist movement. Like Read COINTELPRO. That was how the CIA and FBI infiltrated socialist left-wing movements in the 60s and 50s and pretty much all throughout America's history. And, infiltrated them, had people go into the organizations and make them look bad, sow division, and that's absolutely going on today, especially in a party like DSA that just has so many members. So there's also that going on where, there's psyops to try and make socialism look like people's most ridiculous conception of socialism, which is really just like ultra liberalism. I hate war. Me too. Get Hakeem on the show. Definitely. Definitely will happen soon. As soon as possible. Howdy, y'all. What's up, Sam Dixon? How are you? Hello, Midwestern Marks. Glad to see you spreading the good word. Does anyone have a good slogan, a greeting, or farewell a Midwestern Marxist that can say to show solidarity and goodwill? That's a good question. Maybe we should come up with a word. Hasta luego. I always just say solidarity and throw up the fist / the flex. Had to buy it on Audible so I can listen to it during my time theft at work. Yep. Take those hours back from your boss by reading Theory on company time. Boss makes $1, I make a dime. That's why I read Lenin on company time. Under communism, everyone will have signed copies of Black Shirts and Reds. Yes, absolutely. We just got to get communism established while Michael Parenti is still with us. So let's get to it, y'all. Hassan and Voosh were my introductions to the left, and every day I wish it was Parenti. Yeah, there's always stuff that you think is good or that you learn or get obsessed with before you find like Marxism and the real global international historical socialist struggle that's supported by people like Michael Parenti in the West. Like I was really into Kyle Kulinski, and I probably spent like 2 or 3 years watching him and researching Medicare for all and free college policies. And not that those things are useless to understand or research, but I wish I would have been watching Parenti lectures and Richard Wolff even. And that was, Richard Wolff was my transition out of Kyle Kulinski, as well as Michael Brooks, and into Marxism. And for those who don't know, Michael Brooks was reading Lenin towards the end of his life. So rest in peace to that man. But yeah, no shame. You just got to unlearn some of that stuff then, or replace your knowledge with your old crappy knowledge with new good knowledge. Zen is the antidote to identity. I like it. I don't know what Zen means exactly, but does Zen mean class unity and being where you are, being present without being hyper-focused on your identity and how you present yourself? Thank you very much for the super chat, Ross, as always. One of the most consistent supporters of the show. Really appreciate Ross. The Yellow Parenti speech did more for my political development than years of BreadTube. I can imagine so. Parenti has so many good lectures. One of my favorites is his JFK lecture. And one of the saddest things about TikTok permanently banning 7 or 8 of our accounts is that I had a video explaining the argument, or making the same argument that Parenti makes about JFK, in front of the JFK Memorial in Fort Worth, Texas. It was so perfect. And it obviously got a good amount of views, and now it's gone forever because TikTok sucks and they consistently permanently ban us. What do you think about China donating $18 in military aid to the Philippines government, who's currently trying to repress their communist revolution? Yeah, I've looked into that. I mean, it's what I always say. It's China's policy of complete non-interventionism, right? Like China does not make political distinctions when it comes to trade. They trade with Israel, right? They just have a trade policy based in 100% in mutual development. And that's to avoid putting a target on their back with the U.S. like the Soviet Union did by trying to trade and fund revolutionary movements. Like the difference in China's foreign policy and the Soviet Union is China says Duterte and the Philippines are, an established, recognized state according to international law. So we're going to trade with them and, help them develop and engage with them as a foreign country. And we're not going to say, because of some political movement in the country, we're going to adjust our trade policy like the U.S. does, right? The U.S. says, oh, if there's a socialist movement growing in a country, we're going to cut you off from financing from the IMF and World Bank and put you under economic sanctions and adjust our trade policy. China says we're not going to do that at all. Regardless of the political movements in the country, we'll trade with anyone as long as it's mutually beneficial. And whereas the Soviet Union would have funded the Philippines Communist Party, right? Dump money and support into them probably, and not supported or not traded with the government. And I mean, I've always said that I prefer the Soviet policy, right? I wish China would be more selective in who they trade with based on political reasons like that. I would ultimately prefer they dump a bunch of money into the Philippines Communist Party rather than the government. But I also understand why China's doing what they're doing, right? I understand why they have that policy of mutual cooperation and complete non-interventionism. Because the second they start adjusting their trade policy to push for certain political things, the U.S. is going to flip out. Oh, China's spreading communism. We need to contain communism before China spreads it everywhere. Blah blah blah. Versus China's current policy, they can just keep financing development, industrializing, developing their allies, trading with them, and letting the socialist communist liberation movements develop on their own within these countries. But that's military aid, not trade. Were they giving military aid to the Philippines? I mean, this amounts to trade, but because war is based in production as well. Anyone have a way to find that Parenti speech on JFK? It's called like The Gangster Nature of the State. I thought it was on YouTube. It used to be. Yeah, it's on YouTube. I'll put her in the chat for you. Thanks for your input, Eddie. For sure. Thank you for the great question. If you want to read more about the basis of China's policy, read Xi Jinping's The Governance of China. Here's I got to share my screen. Here's the Parenti article, Michael Parenti, The JFK Assassination and the Gangster Nature of the State. Great lecture. You can also read it. It's somewhere on the recordings in written form. I remember that from when I was doing a video on it. You mentioned Russia nationalizing a little previous stream. Is there anywhere where I could read up on that? That would be wild to see. Where should you read up on that? I don't know any specific articles about that. I mean, it's mentioned in a lot of articles that this Russian state-owned gas company was the one who built Nord Stream and, pumping energy to West Europe and angering the U.S. and competing with U.S. Western multinationals. And obviously, it's kind of a well-known fact that the collapse of the Soviet Union created a human rights disaster for the people in those countries, a complete economic disaster, homelessness and poverty and starvation, drug trafficking, prostitution, all just shot through the roof. But and since the nationalizations have helped with their economic recovery. But I'm blanking on a full book right now. Hakeem made a video on that on post-Soviet Russia. Yeah, I can think of some good ones that talk about the economic disaster that was the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I'm blanking on any articles that specifically focus on Putin's nationalizations. There's not enough Marxists in the US or in the West doing an actual Marxist analysis. I wish I could just pull up Marxist analysis of Russia over the last 10 years, but there's a whole lot of articles just like neither Moscow nor Ukraine or nor NATO, both countries imperialist, both countries bad. It's like, okay, but how about a Marxist analysis of how the Russian economy has developed over the last 20 years? That would be more useful than, just saying neither NATO nor Moscow, but that's just me griping. Just me griping away. So the first story that I want to cover today is the Silicon and Signature Banks crash and subsequent bailout, which the Biden administration is avoiding calling a bailout because they don't want any reference to the 2008 crisis. They don't want people to think we're seeing a repeat of the 2008 crisis, but we may very well maybe. So there are a couple of great articles published about the crash of those banks that we'll cover here. So the first article I want to bring up is from People's Dispatch. This is an article or an interview that they called "A Government for and of the Banks in the U.S." It's an interview with this guy here. I'm not sure if he's an economist or what. He's basically going to lay out the basics of what happened, and I'll just start with that and then comment on it when I'm ready.
Crisis in the United States, the crash.
Sorry, I was muted.
U.S. government, at the end of the day, when it comes to working class people going broke, is always saying, well, we don't really have the money. But when it comes to banks taking insane, risky bets and completely collapsing, they say, don't worry, you're too big to fail, and we got you covered.
There's another banking crisis in the United States. The crash of the Silicon Valley Bank has set alarm bells ringing, people and experts wondering what this means for the banking sector at large, even for the economy of the United States at large. Now, this is a complex subject. There's a lot of debates around interest rates. There's a question of how such a big bank crashed, the fact that the government was quick to come with a bailout for Silicon Valley Bank, as well as offer similar facilities for other banks. To explain all this, we have with us Eugene Pereira of Breakthrough News. Eugene, thank you so much for joining us. So news of yet another banking crisis. I mean, we're hearing a lot of terms about interest rates, about collapses, bailouts, etc., etc. But for the benefit of viewers, could you first maybe just give us a definition of, or a description rather, of what exactly is the crisis? Who are the players and what has brought us to this current situation?
Well, the current banking crisis, or at least potential banking crisis in the United States, is really centered primarily around one bank, Silicon Valley Bank, which is one of the major banks that facilitates the growth of the technology and biotechnology, biopharmaceutical industries, and other similar banks like Signature Bank in New York that sort of serve a similar purpose. By and large, these are the banks that are used by the biggest investors when they are looking to facilitate the growth of the companies they're investing in those sectors. They say go.
So when Lenin is talking about the dominance of finance capital and the increase in concentration of the banks and industry and the merger of banking and industry that takes place really at the transition from the 19th to the 20th century, he's talking about the merger of industrial capital, usually in Lenin's day, like productive capital, things like steel, industries like mining, industries like rail. These were merging together with the big banks, and they were forming giant monopolies that essentially were invested in every industry or controlled part of every industry via stocks, via shares. Now we've seen the merger of the tech sector and the pharmaceutical industry with banking, with finance capital. So it's a similar development to what Lenin was noticing, and it's one that's come about over, the last 40 years of neoliberalism, but really the last 20 years when we're talking about tech and how the pharmaceutical industry is, shot up in their wealth, power, and control over the past 10 or 20 years. So Silicon Valley Bank is a perfect example of that. It finances all these giant tech companies that have monopolized more and more of the tech sector and have become a bigger player in the global and domestic economy, to the point where these Biden regulators said that if they didn't bail out Signature and Silicon Valley Bank, it would have led to a total collapse of the financial system, similar to 2008, even though they don't want to call it a bailout because, it'll be reminiscent of 2008. So this is the kind of crises that you would expect. The kind of, if this is an incoming recession, this is the kind of crisis that you would expect in the neoliberal era, where we've had this giant merger of tech, pharmaceutical, and finance capital, and the monopolization of many industries by those capitalists, folks like Mark Zuckerberg. And COVID led to a boom of these industries, not only the pharmaceutical industry during COVID, who, made tons of money selling the vaccine and enforcing a vaccine apartheid on the global south, but also the tech sector, because more people were in their homes, less people were going outside. So there was a boom in tech, just because people were on their computers and on their phones. So COVID allowed a larger concentration of capital in these industries than there even was before. And this leads to an increased control over the state, an increased control over the government, which is a dictatorship of capital. The state is a tool that has a monopoly on violence. They're the only ones allowed to use violence without being punished. And they use it as a tool of class suppression to suppress the working masses on behalf of the ruling class. They mediate the class relations between the two, the irreconcilable contradiction between the workers and the owners. So with this concentration of capital in the pharmaceutical industry, in the tech sector, and their merger with banking, those industries and the capitalists at the head of those industries have increasingly come to control the state, increasingly come to control the government, the financial oligarchy. So during COVID, we saw obviously a lot of controversy surrounding the mandates. There were cover-ups of information related to the lab leak theory. Read Jeffrey Sachs and the Lancet's final COVID report, if you don't believe me there. There was a lot of censorship. Obviously, we started getting our accounts banned. We had the vaccine apartheid that was enforced on the global south, like I said. And while all these things were going on, all these acts of state repression, Big Pharma was running out the back door with all the money. And for an in-depth analysis of that from me, you can read the Journal of American Socialist Studies 2, which is now available on Midwestern Marks on paperback and ebook, where I do a deep dive into the American healthcare system and the development of it since or during COVID. But yeah, these Silicon Valley executives, the executives at the Silicon Valley Bank that just got bailed out also donated thousands of dollars to the Biden administration, to the Biden campaign when he was running against Trump. And now the DNC and the administration has given all that money to charity, right, to try and save face because people noticed the blatant corruption of Biden and the government bailing out a bank that donated to their campaign. So they donated this money back to charity, but this shows you exactly how the financial oligarchy works, right? The Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank fund the operations of different tech companies, Facebook or Meta or whatever else. And then they lobby the government. They donate money to certain campaigns so that they can control the government. And then when they go under, when there's a crisis, which is they're inherent to capitalism, they're always going to happen. The government can come bail out these banks while everyone else suffers, while everyone else has their jobs laid off, or everyone else gets laid off, or however else. The ruling class tries to respond to these crises. But yeah, not a good sign that this bank is going under. Not a good sign at all. Points towards a recession. There are some people talking about how we already went through a recession under Trump and now we're on the recovery thanks to Biden. That's just partisan hackery. That's just political hackery. That's not how the economy works. I think there's, COVID was not a great economic time for the masses. It was a huge The tech and pharmaceutical companies were making giant sums of revenue, like we said, but it was a little bit of an economic downturn or a slowdown, but I don't think it was the crash. I don't think it was the crisis or the recession that's incoming. So lab leak is BS. Vaccine apartheid also sounds like BS. I mean, do I need to pull out my healthcare administration essays for you? The vaccine apartheid is even acknowledged by mainstream sources, which read the Journal of American Socialist Studies. My article in that discusses all of this. But here's a peer-reviewed academic article from the National Library of Medicine and the National Center for Biotechnological Information. Vaccine apartheid, the separation of the world's poorest and most vulnerable. And this was enforced by the pharmaceutical companies via the World Trade Organization and via these global state apparatuses. Like we were saying, the state, the government, is a tool of capital. So the pharmaceutical capitalists control the World Trade Organization and these other organizations that used intellectual property laws to prevent countries in the global south not just from importing the vaccine, but even making the vaccine, which is why Cuba had to create its own recipe. They had to create their own vaccine different from this vaccine because intellectual property laws were being used to stop the mass manufacturing of something that would have stopped helped stop the spread of COVID. And then if you want to hear about the lab leak, it's definitely not BS. Go to the Lancet COVID final report by Jeffrey Sachs, where he had to kick certain people out of the COVID commission that was hired by the Lancet to investigate this, that Jeffrey Sachs was the chair of, because there were people within the Lancet who were trying to cover up any evidence that there could have been a lab leak. And it's not that we know there's a lab leak, right? It's not that it's 100% certain, but what we know for sure is that the lab leak hasn't been investigated. There's evidence that points to a lab leak. And not only has it not been investigated, but there have been people within these organizations, the NIH, or branches of the NIH that would investigate this. There have been people like Anthony Fauci within those organizations preventing an investigation from being carried out, right? And this is all peer-reviewed, like well-researched academic scholarly stuff. This isn't me pulling this from Breitbart or OAN or some far-right news outlet. This is just me not just gobbling up everything MSNBC or CNN tells me about COVID. I'm getting my master's in healthcare administration right now. I got to look into these things a little bit deeper than that. I was taking an epidemiology class during the height of COVID. Do you think China is involved in the cover-up? I mean, there's certain parts of China would have to be in, like the Wuhan lab, the Wuhan virology lab, that would have to be involved. And then there's certain Chinese media outlets, state media outlets, that have called the lab leak a conspiracy a bunch of times. So it could implicate China and could lead to a criticism of China. Yeah. I know a Marxist criticizing China or saying that China might have done something wrong. What? No. I thought tankies thought existing socialist countries were literally heaven and nothing bad ever happened. Did I already show the video or the article about the banks donating to Biden, Silicon Valley banks? So in relation to that last article about the banks, Mark Zuckerberg was in the news a whole bunch recently for making a bunch of layoffs at Meta, at his new company. So not only did they cut 21,000 total jobs, but they were planning to expand by 5,000 and create 5,000 new jobs, but they got rid of those plans in favor of flattening the organization. So a change in the division of labor at Meta, basically just laying off employees so that they have to pay less or don't have to pay so much in wages, and they can keep their absurd profits really high. So since 2022, the tech sector has seen 290,000 workers lose their jobs. So huge layoffs in the tech sector, where we just saw these two giant banks collapse. Those banks, like we said, are inextricably merged with these tech companies. They're the source of financing for these tech companies. And, they oftentimes, banking executives and people on the board of these banks own a lot of shares in the tech companies. So they're, directly merged like that. So increased interest rates from the Fed have been designed to combat inflation, because that's the only way that capitalists have to combat inflation, is to tighten the money supply. So the increased interest rates have hurt big pharma and big tech, who, like we said, are merged with these big banks, because that's where they get their financing from. The capitalists in tech and pharma have to purchase with money productive commodities. The commodities are the goods that are needed to produce whatever goods and services they sell. And then those productive commodities, along with the labor of their workers, creates their product. And their product is sold for more money than what it costs to produce it. And that's how they make their surplus, and how they pay to keep their operations going steadily. But a lot of those productive commodities, a lot of their labor and tools and means of production are financed by Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank. Like I said, these companies and these banks are inextricably merged. So if the Fed jacks up interest rates, that's going to make the financing from these banks more expensive for these companies. Now these companies are making millions and millions and millions of dollars in corporate revenue and paying out millions of dollars in shareholder dividends every year. But are they going to cut that? Absolutely not. They're going to cut their workforce, which is what we're seeing now. So as the interest rates go up, these banks start to collapse and the workforces start to be cut, which is how capitalist crises work. And there's ways that the capitalists, the ruling class, has of slowing them down, of trying to prevent them from happening all at once, like the bailing out of Silicon Valley and Signature Bank, or the Fed increasing interest rates, but they lead to effects elsewhere in the economy, negative effects elsewhere. And it's essentially just pushing the crisis back, just putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound that's bound to burst open. So if for those who have read Capital, you can think about this as the circuit of capital that Marx talks so much about in Volume 2. The capitalists need to put forward money for labor and productive commodities, which produce commodities, which the capitalist then sells for more money. But the money that he uses to purchase his productive commodities is largely coming from the banks in modern capitalism. So if interest rates on the loans, the financing that he gets from the banks, go up, it's going to decrease his ability to purchase the productive commodities he needs to create his products, which he uses to make his profit. So the total amount of money that they're producing is going to go down. Marxist economics is cool. It helps us understand all this stuff. How cool. So like I said, none of these companies are hurting for revenue. Their revenue rates are actually still growing while this is happening and while these layoffs are going on. And the only solution that government regulators and the Fed and the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, have offered is, further hiking interest rates to tighten the money supply. The capitalists have no solution to the crises at the core of their system besides, hike interest rates and bail out the giant banks, bail out the giant corporations, and let all the working people suffer. So essentially what increasing the interest rates does for the Fed is increase the reserve army of labor, increase this reserve army of unemployed people looking for work that Marx talks about as a necessary element of capitalism. Pushing people out of their jobs by raising interest rates and decreasing the financing that big corporations can get from these banks is going to push people into unemployment and increase and maintain the size of that reserve army of labor. So shout out to People's Dispatch for writing this article from a class perspective, really from a Marxist perspective, because a lot of the perspectives that you get on these developments in the tech sector are not as good, not as thorough, not as based in class analysis. So this goes over just what happened at Meta. So with Meta's recent layoffs, there was one layoff where last November where they laid off 11,000 workers, and then recently they laid off 10,000, and workers had a town hall meeting with Zuckerberg where they essentially berated him and interrogated him about the recent layoffs. So, this could be a sign of recession. Like I said, it also could be a sign that people don't like Meta. Um, my only experience with Meta is the Meta Business Suite, which is supposed to like help you upload videos to Facebook and Instagram in an efficient way. And it just sucks. It like literally doesn't even work. So can't stand the Meta Business Suite. Not a huge fan of Meta, but I think more so than demand for Meta products going down, this is a sign of the increasing inflation, increasing interest rates, and incoming economic crisis, which are built into the core of our system. So it's not just old Zuckerberg's fault. Either way, one of the employees at this town hall asked him, "How can we trust you given recent events?" And Zuckerberg responded, "I would guess that the way you will evaluate whether you trust me and whether you want to work at this company is whether we're succeeding and making progress towards the overall state of goals. Also, I think it comes down to results." So first of all, Zuckerberg is a robot, the way he responds to people. But second of all, you see the conflicting interests between him and his employees, right? His employees just don't want to get laid off. His employees want their wages insured. They want to know that they won't starve, right? They want to know that they're going to be able to put food on the table and pay rent every month. Whereas Zuckerberg is worried about meeting organizational goals. He's saying you should evaluate whether you want to work here based on, whether we're hitting our organizational goals. Well, what are your organizational goals? Your organizational goals clearly are to maintain revenue and maintain these massive shareholder dividends, massive profits, even if that means cutting your labor force, right? So that shows that you prioritize profits over everything. Otherwise, you would have cut corporate revenues and, kept these workers on board. So you achieving your strategic goals for the company and keeping revenue high doesn't necessarily protect the livelihoods of the workers, right? And the workers don't care about strategic goals. Like I said, they just want to be able to put food on the table. They just want benefits and, probably less hours working at this place. But Zuckerberg says you should work here, because we're achieving our company goals. We're achieving our corporate goals. Basically associating or portraying his own interests, his shareholders' interests with the interests of all of society, with the interests of his workers, when in fact those interests are not the same. Whoa, we have a lot of followers now. Hello, 132 people. Do we just get rated? Welcome to everyone new. Thank you. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Whoa, 239. What's going on? Holy crap. Welcome to everyone new. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe. Midwestern Marks. Woohoo. So now I'm kind of distracted. Where was I? So one of the most interesting articles that I saw published in response to this, the layoffs in Silicon Valley and the layoffs at Meta, was this article, Zuckerberg and the Tech Party. And what he means by tech party is what this author calls the year of Zen, the year of corporate Zen. So these tech companies like Google and Facebook or Meta and whatever else have been like trying to portray themselves as really cool, hip companies. Like, we have a ping pong table in the office. We have a putting green in the office. Here at Google, we have Sushi Fridays where we serve you sushi. But their workers are still being exploited, right? It's a distraction from the consistent exploitation of labor and the tough working conditions that these workers are in. Someone must have shared your link. Well, now we lost all our new followers, so they must have hated the stream. But it was nice to have you all while you were here. So this author says it's not just the cuts themselves that are striking here. It's the tone, which Zuckerberg announced the new wave of austerity measures. He adopted the vernacular of the boss of an old economy company. He was a cost killer. He was cold. It isn't personal, it's just business. He was a normal boss. He said that we need to make all organizations as lean as possible. He used the word efficiency a dozen times, including 3 times in the first 2 paragraphs. These 2 paragraphs are a catch-all of corporate lingo that says everything and nothing. Improve our financial performance, difficult environment, execute, optimize, work streams, processes, changes, uncertainty, and focus. He sounds like the CEO of a traditional company. His post is a manual, a guide that other tech CEOs will use as well. So basically saying this, friendly disposition of the tech bosses, this friendly disposition of Google and Zuckerberg and Meta towards the public and towards their workers is over, right? They're no longer these hip, zen, progressive companies. They're now going to be cold, hard, efficient cost killers, which is what they were anyways, right? They, bought their workers a few, like Sushi Fridays when profits were shooting through the roof during the boom cycle that's leading to the upcoming bust cycle. But ultimately, these are corporations who are subject to the will of the market, right? And if they can keep their surplus value at a certain rate by cutting the labor force, by firing workers, that's what they're going to do. They're not going to ever cut into their own revenues first. They're always going to look out for their class interests. And Zuckerberg even told one of the workers, I want to take accountability for these decisions and for how we got here. I know this is tough for everyone, and I'm especially sorry to those impacted. Like, if you want to take responsibility, if you are truly sorry for these people, why don't you cut shareholder dividends? Why don't you cut stock buybacks? Right? Why don't you cut any of the millions of dollars in surplus value? Or why don't you cut corporate lobbying and stop spending millions of dollars lobbying the government, influencing their policies? Right? These are all places where Meta is spending their surplus value that could be used to pay for workers' wages. So is Zuckerberg really sorry? Is his heart really with those people? Or is he a multimillionaire who's going to screw over as many thousands of people as he needs to continue amassing and accumulating wealth? So this article says that tech and Silicon Valley now enter the normal corporate world. In this world, what matters is pleasing the markets, and markets like cost cuts. The employee is secondary. If you make big profits with the least possible cost, the markets applaud. It's like just saying the quiet part out loud about capitalism, just admitting what capitalism is, that there can never be Zen capitalism, that there can never be friendly capitalism, there can never be humanitarian capitalism that takes care of its workers, because the markets are always going to force even the nicest capitalists to be cold, calculating American psychos. This article also says, interestingly, Zuckerberg's announcements come at the same time as the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, a major player in the startup ecosystem and in Silicon Valley. The two events cannot be separated. Their symbolism is strong. It is the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, or rather, meeting of the old economy and the new one. In case anyone still has doubt, Zuckerberg also appears to be ending the era of remote work at Meta, so not letting people work outside the office anymore. Tech companies previously backed off from forcing employees back into the office. So increasing the intensity of labor, trying to get more value out of his workers by having them in the workplace where they can crack the whip, the management staff can crack the whip on them. Trying to suck more value out of these workers in a time of crisis. And like I said, he calls it the meeting of the old economy and the new economy. It's a transition to, a dominance of tech, finance, and tech capital, finance capital, and pharmaceutical capital is what has come concentrated at the top and come to monopolize the capitalist economy in the modern day. So it is a transition, and, it's not surprising at a time of crisis to see these new rulers of the economy, these tech and pharmaceutical capitalists and bankers, crack down on their workforces. Markets necessitate not just exploitation, but the maximization and the intensification of that exploitation by the bosses, right? So it's not just that they have to exploit their workers, but they also have to not let their workers work remote. right? Because they might have too much free time that way and they need to be working, creating value for me. So no more working remote. You got to be in the office. Increasing the intensity of exploitation, which increases the production of surplus value. Eddie, could we take the best parts of socialism and capitalism and make well, socialism is a transitionary state out of capitalism. So any socialist system is going to have to begin with capitalism. And you're going to have to transition out of this system into a better one. So there are going to need to be policies that we enact like tomorrow, right? Like we'll nationalize this industry, we'll enact free healthcare, universal healthcare. We'll do this and that tomorrow as part of the ultimate transition to a socialist or communist society. But if you don't have that end goal, if you don't ultimately eliminate classes and move towards socialism and communism, a society dominated by the working masses, by the working class, eventually the capitalists are just going to regain power. They're just going to regain their wealth and their control of the state, which, I mean, it's part of the tendency that capitalism has to accumulate. That's part of it, because these capitalists produce surplus value. The capitalist production process, every capitalist production process is the production of surplus value, which includes profit and the expansion of operations for that capitalist. So the accumulation and concentration of wealth and power at the top is built into the core of the system. It's built into capitalism. So if you don't change the relations of production, if you don't change the core of the system, if you don't move out of capitalism into a qualitatively different system, the capitalists are just going to accumulate and eventually regain their dictatorship. But yeah, the first days of socialism will look like a mix of socialism and capitalism. Slowly get rid of all the contradictions and bad parts about capitalism over time. You should talk about Angola sometime. I've also been wondering about what you said on RBN about permanent revolution. How would you discern what you mean from the Trotskyist idea of it? Well, thank you for the recommendation. Thank you very much for the $10 super chat. Really appreciate that. Supporting our project. If just so you know, you can become a $10 Patreon supporter or a $10 YouTube member, and then you'll get a copy of the Journal of American Socialist Studies along with your contribution. But thank you. What I said about RBN on permanent revolution. I mean, I'm not an expert in Trotsky, right? I'm not like a Trotsky scholar, and there are people who are. But I just never have really understood the idea of permanent revolution, because people argue permanent revolution. They say that Stalin supported socialism in one country and Trotsky supported permanent revolution, right? But then people get the idea that Stalin didn't want to spread socialism, or he didn't believe that, communism and socialism would be a global thing, which he absolutely did. So that's a distortion that people make. And Trotsky was arguing things like, the Soviets shouldn't come to France's aid when they got invaded by Nazi Germany, because France isn't socialist, right? And we should only ally with socialist countries. So the permanent revolution theory was being used to argue for really weird and bad positions at the time that it was invented. And then if you read like Stalin's Marxism and the National Question, he's straight up like, the Soviet Union will fund and support liberation movements, socialist movements, revolutionary movements everywhere. And this not only includes movements that are explicitly for socialism, doesn't only include the communist parties of various countries, but any national liberation movements. So at this time, all these African countries and some Latin American countries were rising up and demanding their independence, their political independence. There was these anti-colonial struggles at the end of World War II, where Europe and the US had to give up all their colonies, or especially Europe. And the Soviet Union and Stalin said, we're going to support these liberation movements, even if they're not explicitly socialist, right? Because national self-determination, anti-colonialism is the basis that a lot of imperialized countries need to start building socialism, to start developing socialism. So, I do think that Stalin believed in permanent revolution. He believed in global revolution, which is why I don't understand really where his ideas differ from Trotsky's. Although I know Venezuela really likes the permanent revolution theory, and they've worked that into some of their stuff, which it all makes sense to me. Like when I read the Venezuelan Chavistas' permanent revolution ideas, I'm like, these are good ideas, they make sense, but like I feel like Stalin would support these ideas. This isn't going against anything Stalin said, or Stalin's idea of socialism in one country. I mean, socialism in one country, like Dr. Anthony Montero says, like, what are you going to do if you can't build socialism in all the countries, right? You got to do what you can in your own country while you help other countries develop themselves and make the transition on their own, like China's doing. But like Trotsky's permanent revolution, as I understand it, is the idea that we should just stay in a constant state of revolution, right? But eventually, after the Russian Revolution, the people were tired of fighting. They were tired of revolution. They were ready for peace and economic construction. So you got to have socialism in one country. But thank you very much for the super chat. Andy, I still haven't gotten a response to my email. You didn't get my response? I definitely sent you a response, Jacob. Check again. I sent it from Midwestern Marks. Let me see here. I'm trying to find where I sent it. Because I most definitely did. I mean, in Carlos, we sent you, yeah, we emailed you, and we said that we're going to publish it with the Youth League. So thank you for that article, and congrats. Congrats, you can get your work published on the greatest revolutionary media outlet in the modern era. To me, it sounds like Stalin has the idea that Marxism is truth, and when self-determination is attained, they also achieve or realize some form of Marxism. This is also the idea that Tao had. Interesting way of putting it. And thanks again for the super chat. Really, really appreciate that and you supporting our project. Yeah, definitely. It's definitely and I think this is what China's Belt and Road Initiative is too. Right, because China's saying we're going to have this trade policy of complete non-interventionism and mutual cooperation. We're not going to alter our trade policy because of the politics of this country we're trading with. We're just going to trade with them and not mess with their politics. They're, by industrializing these countries, by building up their productive forces, these countries are also creating a working class. It's creating a proletariat, an exploited class, who I think China believes will eventually take hold of the state and move those countries towards socialism, right? So you don't need to necessarily funnel a bunch of money into political movements, into communist movements, and try and alter the politics of these countries the way that the Soviets did in many ways. All you need to do is support their sovereignty, right? Support the people of this country controlling their country. And if that happens, they'll move towards socialism on their own. Because socialism is when the majority is in power of the economy rather than this small ruling minority. So if you have self-determination, if you have control by the people, it's only a matter of time before the class struggle takes its course and the ruling class comes to be in control of the economy. I think that's what Stalin believed, and with his theory of self-determination, like you said, that Marxism and class struggle is truth. It's going to be carried out regardless of, it's going to be carried out by the people as long as they're not being suppressed by imperialist dominators and finance capitalists. And then I think that's what China's Belt and Road is too. So thanks again. $20 worth of super chats. Really, really appreciate that. Did you send it to the correct email address? I sent it as a response to the article you sent. So you sent me the article and I replied with my response. What China is doing is creating an unprecedented amount of goodwill towards a superpower. Here in Africa, China has a very good reputation now. Very interesting. Thanks for putting that, Sir Duke. It's always interesting to get perspectives from all around the world. But I could imagine. I mean, the U.S. is flipping out and calling this debt trapping, right? But it's not debt trapping. The loans are set at around 4%. The loans China's giving these countries for development. They have about 4% interest rates, which are about the same interest rates that the U.S. gave Western Europe with the Marshall Plan when they were trying to build up their allies in Western Europe after World War II, when many of them had been hit by the fighting and had their industry destroyed by fighting. So China is building these countries up, and the countries realize that, right? They realize they're not being debt trapped, largely because all these countries in Africa have been debt trapped by the IMF and the World Bank and these Western banks and finance capitalists for years and years and years. They know what structural adjustment loans are. They know what debt trapping is. They've experienced it firsthand. Now, China has looked at that strategy, that imperialist strategy of debt trapping, and said to combat that, we're going to offer these countries an alternative rather than finance with the US and these global arms of finance capital like the IMF, World Bank, and the thousands and thousands of mini banks that shoot off of them. Rather than take loans from them that are going to trap you in debt and have absurd interest rates and have strings attached that make you change your political system and cut the minimum wage and stuff, we'll give you, loans with no strings attached and small interest rates. And if the debt starts to pile up, China's literally going to forgive it. They've been forgiving debt left and right. Like, of course, that's going to build up goodwill in Africa. And, there's only so much propaganda that the US can do. Like, maybe they can brainwash our people that China's debt trapping Africa, but you can't trick the people in Africa into thinking that, not a majority of them. Why would they believe the country that's debt trapped them for years? Isn't non-interventionism a tacit endorsement of the status quo in a way, though? No, because Marxism is this is a good question, but Marxism is the idea that everything's in constant flux. Everything's in constant change. The class struggle is objective, right? It's not something that we invented in our heads and made up. It's something that's always being waged, always going on, regardless of whether we're thinking about it or not. And that is in every country. There's a unique class struggle that's being waged. So, China doesn't believe that their funding and industrializing these countries is going to lead to maintenance of the status quo, right? Development in these countries is, one, going to help bring people out of poverty, help meet people's material needs in these countries that have been suppressed and prevented from increasing their productive forces by imperialism for years and years and years. But also these countries have developing political movements based on the development of the class struggle. And China doesn't, they just believe they don't need to jump into these countries' politics, meddle in their politics, shell a bunch of money out for the Communist Party in these countries to have them move in a progressive or a positive direction. China believes that class struggle is ongoing, and to aid it, all they have to do is finance development. I don't have anything of substance to contribute at the moment, but I want to thank you for your content, Eddie. I'm here to watch and learn. Thank you very much, Happy Heathen 13. We're happy to have you here. Don't feel like you have to contribute. Totally okay to just watch and observe and learn. That's what I did for like 2-3 years. I used to go in these Zoom chats with Carlos and our friend Alex, who had been a Marxist for a lot longer than me, and I would just sit there like with my mouth open as they had debates about Marxist countries and in-depth theoretical topics. And I was like, what are these guys talking about? It sounds like they're speaking a foreign language. But you catch on faster than you'd think. I believe that you responded, but I didn't get it. Okay, I'll just shoot you another one. I'll just forward it to you. That after the stream. You have to help yourself before you can help others. When a rain collector tips, the water spreads thin, then evaporates. True. You got some poetic analogies here. Third eye saw destruction. It was deep. The people of Africa haven't been through 60 years of anti-communist brainwashing. I've always wondered what the level of propaganda is in Africa, because I know, like, when the U.S. was doing their regime change efforts in Libya and Syria, there were not only propaganda campaigns here at home, but the U.S. outsourced propaganda campaigns to these countries using social media, especially in what's called the Arab Spring, to basically forge together this coalition of U.S.-backed right-wing extremists, essentially. They were called rebel coalitions because there wasn't even one leading political group that the U.S. could support or give money and arms to. It was just these coalitions of extremists that they helped bring together. So obviously there's been propaganda outsourced to Africa, but I don't know if it's the same degree as Latin America, right? Because in Latin America, you had Operation Condor, where the techniques that the CIA developed in MK Ultra for torture and brainwashing were exported to Latin America, and they were giving their preferred Latin American dictators, who were often installed by the CIA, kill lists of all the socialist and leftist agitators that exist in that area, so that these dictators could torture and kill them. And this went on for years. Operation Condor throughout the southern cone of Latin America. And, that's just one operation. There were tons and tons of different concerted efforts to propagandize Latin America. In addition to, there just being a lot of Western media outlets in that region, reporting in that region, controlling the media in that region. It's almost like a mini McCarthyism swept across Latin America. Like a lot of the same anti-communist propaganda talking points that you get in the U.S. Have been brought to Latin America, and you'll hear from people in Latin America, you'll hear in arguments between socialists and reactionaries in Latin America. So, it's interesting to look at how the McCarthyite Red Scare propaganda has pushed the movement for socialism back in the U.S., and then how much that narrative has spread to other countries. Obviously, China has been pretty much exempt from it. They pretty much haven't allowed it to get into their borders. Russia was probably indoctrinated with it during the collapse of the Soviet Union. They weren't indoctrinated with it. Latin America was. Africa, I don't know to what degree, but. Unfortunately, I have to leave. I have a meeting with Pullistern later. Oh, cool. We're reading historical materialism. See you later. See ya. Good luck with your meeting. Yeah, I've been to a School of the Americas protest in the past. Very cool. Now, that's one of the ways they control Latin America. OAS. My friend from Cameroon told me Gaddafi is his hero. Interesting. I'm not surprised. Yeah, some good questions here. The propaganda was different, though economic sanctions, the standard of life falls, and apolitical people blame it on socialism. That's what happened in my country. Gotcha. I mean, that makes sense. That's usually what, like, the capitalist propaganda is usually projection, because what they're trying to associate with socialism is usually caused by capitalism. Sanctions, structural adjustment loans, whatever, hurt African countries, and then the U.S. throws a dose of propaganda on top of that economic warfare. It says, guess what? The results of this economic warfare, that's all from socialism. Did you power through the rest of Volume 2 with that energy syrup? I didn't. I had too much actual homework to do. I couldn't even focus on Volume 2 till I went and did my actual homework, and then I was up till 2:30 a.m. last night doing that homework, so that was fun. Got her done, though. The Communist Party should be able to fund themselves. I don't think China should be funding communist parties. Help with education would be appreciated, though. Yeah, but wouldn't that be funding if they helped with education? I don't know. Plus, like, if China actually tried to infiltrate the U.S. through like TikTok or social media, that would probably just lead to more. Like, I see what you're saying, and like I said, I ultimately agree. I wish China would do more in terms of supporting revolutionary movements, but I totally understand and respect and support why they have the policy that they do. Because like, if they started funding or doing education like through TikTok, like if China reached out to me when I was when our TikTok account wasn't banned. Well, we have 2 right now, but they'll get banned soon, just like the 7 others. If they started funding me, then Biden or Trump could be like, look, China's funding communist propagandists in the U.S. They're funding communist agitators, people spreading communist ideology. They're infiltrating our country. They're subverting our country. We need to ban TikTok. We need to censor and suppress all these Chinese bots. I mean, they're already doing that with Russia. The mass the mass purge of accounts on TikTok hit 30,000 accounts that they said were Russian bots, and that was what got our first account that had almost 400,000 followers. So we don't need any more censorship, and China trying to infiltrate the U.S. via social media and stuff might lead to more censorship from the ruling class. But y'all can't catch a break with TikTok, LMAO. I know. 7 dang accounts. And they took down our most recent one. The post ban, I can post again tomorrow on the account that I made. But I made a backup account since I got post banned, and I've already got more followers on the backup account. It's like we're just so goated at making Marxist Leninist TikToks that we can't help but go viral and have people find our account in like 2 seconds after getting banned. So like TikTok can't ban us as fast as we can gain followers and go viral. So this is the one that got post banned, but all the videos have still been blowing up. You see, this one has 200,000. This one has 118,000. Which welcome to anybody who joined the stream because they saw one of those videos. We're happy to have you. And then I have this account too that I now have almost 80,000 followers on because I've posted to it more since the other one got post banned. We're simply goated at TikTok. We can't catch a break, but also we can. And that's why they want to ban it. Exactly. Because they know the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism is just that. It's an immortal science. It helps you get to the truth. Right? This is what we mean when we say the truth is revolutionary, or the truth is on our side. They have to straight up ban us. They have to straight up suppress truth. They can't just engage with our arguments on the substance. They can't just debunk us because the truth is revolutionary. The truth is on our side. So we just have to spread the truth. You spread the truth on TikTok, it blows up, and then they censor it. Even if they ban something, you can get around it. Oh, really? Let me know how so I can get our old TikTok accounts back. Hey, Eddie, I know you've been trying to learn Spanish. I highly recommend Cuadernos de Educación Popular de Marta Harnacker. It was written for workers in Allende's Chile, so it's interesting to understand. Oh, awesome. I know Harnacker. That's one of Carlos's favorites. I will definitely read that. Thank you. Yes, I've been reading a Spanish reader about the revolution in Cuba right now. It's just like a beginner Spanish text that goes, there's like one rich tobacco company owning family, and then there's one poor like tobacco peasant farmer family, and their daughter dies due to lack of health care at the beginning of the story, right before the revolution happened. So it's interesting, and I appreciate the further reading material. I did Spanish for like half an hour this morning because I finally got my homework done. I've been a Marxist for a while, but your TikToks made a lot of my friends more open to Marxism, or at least criticism of capitalism. Very cool. Glad to hear it. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know that. The education and the anti-imperialist propaganda, for lack of a better word, but the anti-imperialist truth spreading, getting the truth out there about these regime change efforts is even more important now than it ever was, with the war in Ukraine going on and with these psychotic finance capitalists in charge of our government and in charge of NATO, pushing us ever closer to World War III, doing anything they can to break up a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia while claiming that it's just Putin. It's just Russia who refuses to do a peace agreement. And when you look at how things have changed or not changed in our country since the Iraq War, it makes perfect sense, right? A lot of the people who lied us into this murderous intervention that pretty much everybody now agrees was terrible and was a horrible mistake are still in charge of our government, still in power in some of the most powerful positions in our country, in our government, and some of them are some of the wealthiest people in the country. So you see that that was very apparent reading Consortium News's 20-year retrospective on the Iraq War. This is one of my favorite news outlets, founded by Robert Perry, the late Robert Perry. They did a 20-year retrospective looking back at the Iraq War, what we've learned from it, what it's changed, and how a lot of these figures who lied us into the war have been rehabilitated and are now pushing for NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. They're now pushing for more conflict with Russia and telling us that we should believe them this time, that they've learned their lesson from Iraq. So this is a really good article from Sam Husseini. Husseini's done a lot of great research and investigative journalism into bioweapons and U.S. Bioweapon development, covert and not covert. But the first point that Sam Husseini makes here is the point that we just made in our Iraq War deep dive, which is on our YouTube channel right now, that this was not a failure. It was not a mistake, right? It was an imperialist project on behalf of the oil oligarchs that was carried out successfully, and on behalf of Halliburton and these other weapons manufacturing companies that Vice President Dick Cheney was the chairman of. A lot of people portray it like George Bush was just so stupid. He was just this idiot who bumbled his way into Iraq and did this terrible invasion on accident. But it wasn't on accident. He was a neocon. He was, George Bush, along with John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and these other members of the Bush administration and the U.S. State Department were cold and calculating on behalf of the finance capitalists who prop them up, who fund their campaigns and who lobby them, and the oil companies as well, who essentially pillaged Iraq's oil after the intervention. The second point that Husseini makes is another point that we made in our Iraq War deep dive, that the war didn't start with George W. Bush. It started with the Clinton administration, at least, or probably George H.W. Bush, who did the Gulf War and sanctioned Iraq, killing 500,000 children and laying the basis, laying the historical development that would lead up to the 2002 invasion by George W. Bush. A third point that Husseini makes here that I thought was really good is that Joe Biden participated and presided over the Iraq hearings. Right? And he went on Meet the Press, this really, really popular news outlet or news show, and claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Right. So same thing with George Bush. A lot of times Joe Biden is portrayed as this goofy old man of a president eating his ice cream, and he's doing a better job than Trump. He's just a little silly. He has a little bit of dementia. Old Joe, haha. When in reality, Joe Biden is this person who presided over the Iraq hearings, who actively lied us into the Iraq war, who argued on the Senate floor, argued passionately for harsher and longer prison sentences for nonviolent offenders, arguing for the crime bill. This is somebody who has been an arm and enforcer of the dictatorship of finance capital, the dictatorship of his donors, which controls his sector of the Democratic Party. That's been his entire political career, and that's who he is now. Again, a cold, calculating neoliberal, just like Bush was a cold, calculating neocon, portraying themselves as these silly, nice old men. Joe Biden also gave the eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral, a segregationist. So that's the Sam Husseini article. Another good article that kind of hits on a different point was from Caitlin Johnson. The Bush-era neocons should shut up about Iraq and everything else. So this kind of hits on what I've been discussing a lot lately and what we hit on in our deep dive into the Iraq War, that a lot of these figures have been rehabilitated, right? A lot of these people who were the literal architects of the Iraq War are still in politics, still in positions of power, and still being propped up by the media as talking heads, as people who we should take seriously and, listen to what they have to say about the war in Ukraine. So David Frum and Max Boot here were two of the main media architects or main political establishment pushers, drivers of the Iraq war. And David Frum, at least, has finally admitted that the war was a mistake. He finally admitted that it was executed poorly. However, in his article admitting that the war was a mistake, he falsely claims that there actually was evidence for weapons of mass destruction, which there wasn't. This was a blatant lie pulled out of Colin Powell's butt to justify the war. He also lied and said that the U.S. was provoked by Iraq, right? So he's saying, oh, yeah, the Iraq war was a mistake, but it's not really my fault. How could I have known, right? We were provoked. They had weapons of mass destruction, when in reality they didn't. You guys knew we weren't being provoked. You lied on behalf of the oil oligarchs and corporations that pay you large sums of money. David Frum also says that jihadist terrorism is on the retreat in the Middle East, which has brought them economic stability because of the Iraq war, because of the war that literally created ISIS and allowed Al-Qaeda to become one of the strongest political forces in the region. In the past 20 years, the U.S. has destroyed the economies of Afghanistan and Iraq, left their people in a destitute economic situation with no industrialization. You're going to talk about how jihadist terrorism is on the retreat and economic stability is rising because of the U.S.? It's the opposite. We created ISIS. How can you create ISIS and then say that we're fighting terrorism? We're fighting jihadist extremists. Like, come on. He also argues that Obama should have fully invaded Syria, right? So he's saying, I've learned my lesson from Iraq. It was a mistake. But Iraq was pretty much justified, and we should have done the same thing 10 years ago in Syria. Okay, David, I definitely see that you've learned your lesson. And this was the guy who wrote the Axis of Evil speech that we talked about in our Iraq video, portraying the U.S.'s enemies as literal comic book villains, a literal axis of evil. So that's David Frum. Max Boot also admitted that parts of the Iraq war were wrong, although he's not willing to admit that the whole intervention was a bad thing. He wrote this article called What the Neocons Got Wrong. I was trying to find a picture of it here, but I guess there isn't one. Called it What the Neocons Got Wrong. And this article is a little bit better than his 2001 essay called The Case for American Empire, where he argues that the U.S. should invade Iraq and dominate the Middle East. But the article's still not great. He mentions in this article saying that there were certain mistakes in Iraq, that the Korean War and the Vietnam War were justified. He just mentions that out of nowhere. He pulls it out of his butt. Where those are two of the most murderous and regrettable interventions in U.S. history. We killed 20% of the Korean population, leveled every building over 2 stories tall, and have been occupying the South ever since, but unable to top the DPRK. They've maintained their sovereignty. The war didn't even work. Same with Vietnam, right? Because nobody wanted to support this U.S. puppet South Vietnamese government, and the U.S. troops couldn't defeat the communist Vietnamese guerrilla fighters. So there ended up being thousands and thousands of tons of Agent Orange and napalm dropped on Vietnamese farmland and infrastructure and their water supplies. And it's had terrible ecological effects on the country for years. And obviously the U.S. ended up just retreating in that war without getting anything at all. And then people in the U.S. suffered from PTSD from that war for years and years and years. That almost left a scar on the consciousness of our nation. But Max Boot wants to jump in and be like, the Iraq war, maybe we made some mistakes, but the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, those were cool. Which maybe he's just hoping that someone in the future will do the same thing for him. Someone years from now will look back and defend Max Boot and defend David Frum for doing the Iraq War the same way he's defending Kissinger and whoever else for the Vietnam and Korean War. And David Frum ends his article by saying, the neoconservatives may have got things wrong in Iraq, but the neoliberals are getting things right in Ukraine. And he urges readers to support the NATO war effort in Ukraine. So these goofballs, these neocons, these people who got millions killed through their pushing and propaganda in favor of the Iraq war, are now pushing for and doing propaganda in favor of the war in Ukraine. And even saying, you know, look at us, we've learned our lesson from the war in Iraq, right? We used to be neocons who just wanted war and supported US empire at every turn. But now, now we're reformed. We see the error of our ways, and we think that we should push for war in Ukraine at every turn. We should push for NATO at every turn. It's totally different now, though. We've learned our lesson. It reminds me, like when Lenin and Marx were writing, there were people who would like argue in favor of British imperialism, right? There were people who would be like, well, British imperialism brings us, you know, a lot more wealth. So we should keep exploiting India. We should keep exploiting these countries. It's better for our people. It's better for us. Britain first. And that's what I feel like Max Boot and David Frum are. Rather than lie about their positions, rather than lie about their support of the U.S. empire, they're just like, nope, we literally support U.S. empire. We're literally going to write a book called The Case for U.S. Empire. That sounds like something that a British academic would write in the 1800s, like The Case for the British Empire. So all of these war criminals have been rehabilitated, and all of them are being platformed by mainstream media so that they can share their advice for foreign policy as if they haven't already gotten millions of Americans killed. So this article just focuses on Max Boot and David Frum, but there are others. One of the main ones is Bill Kristol. Right? Bill Kristol is a guy who still hasn't admitted that the war in Iraq was bad. Right? This is somebody who's still defending the invasion of Iraq that he was one of the architects of, that he was one of the main propagandists for. He's still somehow trying to argue that this was good. He hasn't taken responsibility. At one point, Bernie Sanders demanded that he take responsibility for his role in lying the American people into this murderous war. And Bill Kristol responded by saying, nope, I dislike quasi-Stalinist demands for apologies. I've defended and will defend my views on Iraq, Syria, and Milosevic and the Soviet Union and more as you defend yours. How about a real debate on U.S. foreign policy? I'll ask for no apologies on a campus this fall. Well, I'm down, Bill. If you're watching this, I will debate your neoconservative policies, and I'll openly defend quasi-Stalinist demands, unlike Bernie. But hilarious there that he smears him as a Stalinist for calling Bill Kristol out for lying our country into a murderous intervention on behalf of oil oligarchs. Sounds more dictatorial and violent than anything Stalin ever did, Bill Kristol. But this guy is not only still allowed and platformed in American media, but he was part of the Hamilton 68 dashboard, along with John Podesta, a Hillary Clinton ally, and the Obama CIA director, Michael Morrell, and others. But this was the think tank that was caught falsely claiming that thousands of Twitter accounts were Russian bots. Right? Any account critical of the war effort in Ukraine, any account critical of NATO and Ukraine, this dashboard, this Washington, D.C. think tank was going to Twitter and saying, you need to ban this account. It's a Russian bot. Until somebody at Twitter realized what was going on, realized that these weren't actually bots, and they put a stop to it. And recently, all the internal communications between the think tank and Twitter have been leaked. And now we know through what's called the Twitter files. Right, so this is a think tank that has direct influence over the largest social media companies, over the largest platforms of information in the country. And it's run by Bill Kristol. It's run by this architect of the Iraq war. Right, so not only are these people rehabilitated in American society, but they're still controlling what information you get to see. They're still pushing for new imperialist projects abroad. It's the same people, literally the same guys in charge of our government and in charge of our information who lied us into Iraq. And this is Twitter, right, where they push for like 30,000 accounts to be banned. On TikTok, they did ban 30,000 accounts. TikTok hired a bunch of national security operatives and former NATO officials, and they banned 30,000 accounts that they said were Russian bots, including ours, which obviously is not a Russian bot account. And was that pressured directly by a Washington, D.C. think tank? Was that pressured by Bill Kristol, one of the architects of the Iraq War? Who knows, right? Bill Kristol might have, had a hand in pushing for Midwestern marks to be banned. We only know this happened at Twitter because it was leaked, because it was released by Matt Taibbi, or I don't know where he got it from, but he was the journalist who published it. So wild that these architects of the Iraq War still have so much power and have been rehabilitated to such a degree. And now what are they doing? They're pushing for proxy war against Russia. They're pushing for NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe. Think about that. Same architects of the Iraq War, same people who lied us into that murderous intervention are now the people pushing for the war against Russia and Ukraine. Everyone's an anti-imperialist in hindsight, though, right? Everybody can look back at Iraq and say that was bad. That was based on lies, because we know that now. But then there are so many people who would say that and still believe all the BS surrounding Ukraine, still believe all the propaganda surrounding the proxy war against Russia, when it's the same people crafting this propaganda. It's the same people controlling the social media outlets. Same people that lied us into Iraq. And last one, which I just thought of this as I was talking here, is Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney became an anti-Trump Republican, and now she's the darling of liberal media. They freaking love her. And not only that, but supposed progressive commentators like Robert Reich are calling for Liz Cheney to run for president because she's against Trump. This is very progressive, yes. Forget that her father was the chairman of Halliburton, who got millions and millions of people killed trying to expand the profits of the military-industrial complex and military contractors that he was profiting from. Forget all that. She doesn't like Trump, so she should be our president. Like, is this real life? Is this actually real life? We live in a world where left-wing progressive commentators are calling for Liz Cheney to be president. Like, all these progressives who claim that they've learned their lesson from Iraq, and Iraq was so terrible and so many people died and it was all for oil, who are now supporting the NATO war effort in Ukraine against Russia, are the biggest hypocrites I've ever seen in my life. They're just absurd hypocrites. Right? It's literally the same people that led the Iraq war effort leading this war effort and censoring people like us who are trying to tell you the truth. And a lot of these progressives who have their nice place within the political establishment and a nice income tied to that spot in the political establishment or tied to these think tanks or whatever else, they're not going to threaten that income by telling the truth. Don't forget that Albright was praised like a second Jesus by shitlibs. Yeah, we talked about that in our Iraq War deep dive, which I mentioned here a couple times. Carlos Noah, well, I laid out a bunch of facts and did a bunch of research on the Iraq War, and then I just gave a sort of presentation about it while Noah and Carlos jumped in wherever they saw fit. But we hit on that, talked about all the people who have praised. It's
going to be sort of
same with Colin Powell, all right? The guy who literally got up in front of the UN and lied, claiming that they had biological evidence of WMDs. That guy, when he died, there were progressives who were like, what a hero, a person of color in a position of power. How wonderful. Like, what? He got millions of people of color killed in Iraq. Why are we praising this guy? Doesn't help that a lot of socialists that are mainstream don't really help with radicalizing people. Yeah, you're right. Even like, I like Hassan, and I go back and forth on my understanding of Hassan Piker's role within the capitalist system and within, online media. But he mostly only talks about like issues of like culture war stuff, issues of identity, right? He doesn't really hit. He does sometimes, but he doesn't hit as hard as he should on like class issues. Right? He should just be hitting class, pro-working class, make people's lives better. But instead, he's more based on, this video about Ben Shabibo is going to get a million views. So I'll do a video about Ben Shabibo talking about a Disney movie or whatever. And that content's fine, but I don't know if it, helps the image of socialists overall. And I just think his platform could be better focused. But what do I know? I don't have a platform like that either. So he's the one who's been able to build it, which people don't realize how much effort it takes to build a platform too, how much actual labor hours go into that type of project. So yeah, that was Consortium News, remembering the Iraq War 20-year anniversary. Shout out to them for that. One of my favorite outlets. Thoughts on the Deprogram podcast? I like it. It's pretty good. I wish Hassan was more theoretical instead of reaction stuff. Yeah, like I react to videos, right? I react to a lot of videos, but I also try to do theoretical topics. Like I have a segment for Lenin's imperialism planned for one of the days this week, really whenever I want, going over a full chapter of Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And then there are lots of segments like the one I just did where I'll hit on a certain topic or a certain geopolitical concept that I want to flesh out. And then I'll pull up a bunch of news stories, a bunch of articles that show that concept that I'm talking about. So more, educational, I guess, is what I try and make it, more purposeful, more pointed at revolutionary education rather than just pure entertainment. But maybe that's why I'm not as popular as Hassan. Hey, Cobra, educate the working class, for sure. You also have people say, like Judith Miller, who go on PragerU and say the Iraq War was the result of faulty information from the intelligence apparatus that were right about the people responsible for 9/11. Yes, true. Even Judith Miller has been rehabilitated, this journalist who published Iraq has WMDs on in the New York Times, which turned out to be information that was spoon-fed to her from the intelligence agencies, straight from the CIA. So journalism, it's so funny that the government or that the media is supposed to act as a watchdog, as a government watchdog. If you think about that, it is hilarious because of the way that the media actually acts. Not just stenographers to power, but they actively lie on behalf of the people in power and the government and the ruling class. They don't serve as a watchdog in any way, shape, or form. He's a good entry point for normies. You got to read after that. Yeah, that's true. That's what I think the good part about Hassan is. He's a gateway drug. Yeah, for sure. That's why I want to go on Hassan's show. That's why I really want to be on his show. One, obviously, because that would blow up our audience, make it a lot bigger. But two, because I feel like a lot of his audience is probably ready to take that next leap, to get off that gateway drug and go to the hard stuff. I hope that doesn't get me banned. That was a funny joke, though. I crack myself up. I really do. Mainstream media is the Department of State lip service. Absolutely. That's all it is. But if he actually posted a reading list or a creator list, that would help. Yeah. That's why we have our library. And I made a video breaking down, like, here's a good path to understanding Marxism. I have to redo that video, though. Hassan is entry level, Eddie is boss round. I appreciate that. Maybe in terms of YouTube creators, I think reading Marx is boss round. Actually pulling out the books and logging off Twitch and Twitter and YouTube and reading yourself is boss round. But as far as YouTube creators go, I mean, Carlos is probably, he's the boss round if we're talking philosophy. That's hilarious, though. Online, we also need to push harder for people to join their local communist parties. Yes. Otherwise, there's a bunch of people who don't know about Marxism, or who know about a lot about Marxism but don't organize anyone. Absolutely. Right. We need actual organs of worker power, which is why our communist parties in the US need to be better organized, more theoretically advanced, so that we have an organ to push people into, because the energy's there, right? There's willingness to change our system. The conditions for revolution exist. It's just getting people into an organization that's actually going to fight for it. Plus, Hassan supports AOC. Does he really? Man, that's such an L. What does he say about Ukraine? I'm sure he's on to the NATO stuff at least, right? He's got to be. He knows that NATO's full of crap. This one's 8 months ago. On
how Russia.
I don't know. I wanna find one that is more recent. RBN is top tier. I agree. That's who I go to for like political analysis. Like, I've told people I don't love following the day in and day out of like what's going on in Washington, D.C. Like, there are important things that happen in Washington, in Congress, with the executive, judicial, and legislative, or legislative and executive, and freaking, why am I blanking on the 3 branches of government? Dang it. This is really embarrassing as a political science major. Legislative, executive, and judicial. Oh yeah, I think that's what I said. Either way, it's hard for me to stay focused on the day-to-day of that because a lot of it's just such BS. The politicians are such liars. They're always lying about what they're trying to do. But, there are important developments that happen. It's important to at least keep an eye on what's going on in Washington. And that's what RBN does so well. They keep an eye on that. They keep an eye on all the former Bernie people, what they're saying, what the PMC is saying, and they offer a critique of it. It's so good. One of my favorite accounts by far. Hassan calls the Russian military intervention irredentism. Very scary, coming from a leftist. I'm looking into becoming a video editor to make some propaganda for the cause. I'll make some Midwestern Marks fan cams for the people. Please, literally email us, Christopher Romero. Please email us. We need more editors. We need more help with the editing. I don't have enough time and energy to do it all on my own. You can even make like thirst traps and fan cams. I love it. MidwesternMarks@gmail.com. Hassan Piker, Ukraine. Well, Philip DeFranco has a video about Hassan. I'm sure that's terrible.
Sup, you beautiful bastards. Welcome back to the Philip DeFranco Show. I am fresh off a 1 a.m. trip to the emergency room. Fun times. The good news is it appears that they figured out what it was. The bad news is that it appears that it's going to take a few days for me to not be in pain. But today is too important of a show to miss, so hit that like button, you beautiful bastards, and let's just jump into it. The first step today is the U.S. is throwing out sanctions and trying to flex its military muscle to deter Russia. The Pentagon is also now wondering whether we have a certain muscle to flex. And this because in a press release from the military health system, they worry that the new batch of soldier recruits are too weak to fight an actual war. With Army Major John Mark Thibodeau saying the Nintendo generation soldier skeleton is not toughened by activity prior to arrival, so some of them break more easily. Which, one, how dare you assume my console of preference, sir? But two, the release going on to add and claim that Gen Z can't graduate from basic training without hurting themselves because of their, quote, more sedentary lifestyle compared to previous generations. With Fort Leonard Wood's physiotherapist, Army Captain Lydia Blondin saying, we see injuries range to think that it would happen, and even as I hoped that the information was wrong, it wasn't. Russia has launched a full-scale invasion across Ukraine early Thursday morning local time. In a televised speech, Russian President, aka evil fuckface Vladimir Putin, justified the actions by pointing to his defense treaties with the breakaway states in Donbass and adding, I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kyiv regime for 8 years. For that, we will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and will bring to justice those who committed multiple bloody crimes against civilians, including Russian civilians. With the Russian Foreign Ministry later tweeting out a similar statement. But to be absolutely clear here, the narrative that Ukraine has engaged in some kind of genocide against the people in Donbass is completely false, and no serious proof has ever been provided. And as far as Ukraine allegedly being run by Nazi supporters, there's only like 2 pieces of quote unquote.
That's all he says about the war in the Donbass. There's no evidence that anything was going on in Ukraine. I mean, yeah, there is. There's like a Wikipedia page called the Donbass War that mentions how the Kiev regime, I mean, obviously it's biased and filled with U.S. propaganda because it's Wikipedia, but everyone knows the Kiev regime that was installed in 2014, whether you know that was, heavily backed and would have been impossible without the U.S., was a U.S.-backed coup effort, whether you're aware of that or believe that or not, which it was. But Whether you believe that or not, there was a war that kicked off after the Maidan regime took power. After this coalition of people rising up took power of the government, they started shelling the homes of people in the Donbass and started a war with people in the Donbass, which was called a civil war by many. And 14,000 people died in this war, right? There's plenty of evidence of that. People died on the Ukrainian side and on the Donbass side. There have been these militias and armies that have formed in the Donbass as a way to resist the Kiev regime shelling their homes and stuff. There was actually a guy called Russell Texas Bentley who went to the Donbass when he saw what was going on and fought alongside those people. Right? And Putin decided to invade and try and put an end to this war, but it was going on since 2014. All right, so what do you mean there's no evidence of that? There's evidence even in mainstream media. What the heck are you talking about, Phil? It never makes sense, Phil. You are just a simp for NATO.
Evidence they try and use. And I say that because part of it comes from history. In World War II, when some Ukrainians initially accepted German troops as liberators from Soviet Russia, they came to regret that decision and millions of Ukrainians died fighting the Nazis. And in more recent times, there are a few far-right Nazi-aligned militia groups running around in the Donbass region fighting, with images of these groups constantly being spread by Russian media as if this is how Ukrainians are as a whole. But understand, they are fringe groups fighting in a relatively lawless region. Also, Putin's claim that Ukraine is a Nazi state, or especially...
How can you say they're fringe groups when they were brought into the literal Ukrainian military? The Azov Battalion, this far-right extremist neo-Nazi group that the Western media acknowledged was a neo-Nazi group, was filtered into the Ukrainian military. They were given an actual spot within the Ukrainian National Guard, and they were the ones leading up this war in the Donbass. And there's a video of Zelensky talking to these right-wing militias, some of their leaders, and they're bossing Zelensky around. And Zelensky's telling them they need to chill out and stop attacking people in the Donbass. And these leaders are literally mocking him and laughing at him. Like, yeah, sure. We'll stop fighting any day now. Right? There's so much evidence that the U.S. NGO-backed extremist groups in Ukraine were leading the civil war against the Donbass as soon as this regime was installed. But Phil's just going to gloss over that. This is what constitutes journalism in the U.S. Philip DeFranco just literally like reading off a NATO teleprompter.
Laughable when you consider that Ukrainian President Zelensky is Jewish. And speaking of Zelensky, it appears that he tried up until the last...
No, Phil, your argument is laughable. It's not laughable to say that there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine because their president's Jewish.
Second to figure out a diplomatic solution. Hours before the invasion, he pleaded directly to the Russian people, telling them, "You've been told I'm going to bomb Donbass." Bomb what? The Donetsk Stadium where the locals and I cheered our team at Euro 2012? The bar where we drank when they lost? Luhansk where my best friend's mom lives? With him even calling Putin right before the invasion order was given, but he was essentially left on voicemail. Also around the same time as Putin's speech, an emergency meeting of the UN was held, but Ukraine was understandably not having it, especially because the meeting was actually run by the Russian ambassador, and by the end of the meeting, Ukraine's ambassador told his Russian counterpart,
"There is no purgatory for war criminals."
It's so stupid. How can they deny that there's been bombings and shellings of the Donbass? 14,000 people have died, right? But because it's being led by these Western armed and Western backed militias like the Azov Battalion, who weren't always an actual part of the Ukrainian military, because it was led by them. They're saying, oh, the president's Jewish, right? And the president didn't declare war on the Donbass. War broke out in the Donbass after the US-backed coup, but the U.S. puppet president never actually declared war, so therefore the Donbass isn't being attacked at all. But it's so stupid. It's just like, if you know what's actually going on the ground, the way that they just cherry pick facts to try and portray a narrative that's just totally not in touch with reality is mind-blowing. Like Zelensky being like, I never ordered a bombing of the Donbass. That means that nothing's going on in the Donbass. Like, then why is there a Wikipedia page called the Donbass Civil War with 200 sources about the Donbass Civil War that happened after the Maidan coup?
They go straight to hell. Ambassador.
But despite all those efforts, shortly after Putin's speech, Russian forces started targeting Ukrainian assets. First, civilians in major Ukrainian cities were woken up early in the morning by the sound of missile attacks and air raid sirens. Russian missiles seeming to target airports, warehouses, ports, military bases, and in the capital, they hit administrative military buildings. Though, that said, as to be expected with this, there are plenty of reports that missiles have also hit civilian buildings. And since all this, Russian forces have made a large breakthrough in the Donbass region and began to encircle Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, with Russian forces reportedly alongside Belarusian allies also crossing the border into northern Ukraine and are making their way to Kyiv. There was also reportedly intense fighting near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, something Zelensky called a declaration of war against the whole of Europe because of how dangerous damage to the containment facility could be. However, it looks like as of recording this, Russian forces have managed to take the site, inching the northern forces that much closer to Kyiv. And in the south, Russian forces crossed into Ukraine from Crimea. Well, missile attacks have also been reported in Odessa and Mariupol as well. You have Zelensky announcing that the country has faced serious losses amid the early stages of the Russian campaign and that at least dozens have died. But I also don't want to get too much.
I got to skip to the part about Hassan because that's why we came here in the first place. And this is just basic NATO propaganda from Phil, as usual.
Stuck there. And so companies and organizations.
By the way, for those who don't follow us on TikTok, Phil is one of the main or one of the largest TikTok news accounts, one of the largest TikTok news outlets. And I would do a lot of videos responding to him and pointing out why his videos are NATO propaganda. And that would almost always lead to our account eventually being taken down or our videos being censored and banned. I don't know. I imagine it's just Phil's fans, coming and reporting our video for misinformation. But so this is the kind of info that's being boosted on TikTok, the fastest growing social media platform in the country that's popular with children. This is the kind of info that's being boosted, this misinformation, while people spreading the truth like us are being systematically suppressed. So it's the systematic brainwashing of the youth that's pretty scary.
Organizations like Team Liquid have opened up their doors to Ukrainian players so they can have a place to stay while all of this goes down. Also on social media, you had a number of people taking shots at and dunking on a number of influencers, including Hassan Piker. And this because he was one of the many people that was spreading the narrative that it's laughable that Russia would do anything. With him tweeting last week, listening to NPR reporters confused about why the people on the ground in Ukraine are calm when a Russian invasion is imminent is hilarious. They're confused why no one's taking money out or leaving towns. Maybe it's because the Ukrainians don't watch American news every day. And this is the hill I will die on. Russia cannot launch an urban counterinsurgency war in a neighboring country with 44 million people with or without NATO support. This is why I've been saying he won't invade Ukraine, not because of anything else. He's a bad person, not a mad one. But to his credit, unlike a number of other influencers I've seen, he has kind of owned the mistake, sharing a tweet that argued many analysts in Moscow thought the buildup was bluff, and writing himself didn't think a regional power would act so irrationally. I know Putin doesn't care about lives, but these actions also directly harm his geopolitical interests. I've admitted my mistakes. I got things wrong. I hope Ukrainians are safe. Then look.
There were people accusing me too. So I made the mistake of saying at first, like, this isn't going to be an invasion. It's going to be a special military operation. And the U.S. is going to claim that Russia invaded Ukraine when actually they're just going into the Donbass to protect these people in the Donbass. So I said Russian troops are going to enter Ukraine. They're going to do a special military operation. The U.S. is going to freak out. And then they're going to pretend like Russia invaded Ukraine and start sending all their troops and money and weapons there. So as far as the substance, my analysis was right, but there were people saying, oh, you thought Russia wasn't going to invade. You don't know shit. This just proves that you're spreading misinformation. You didn't think they were going to invade. I'm like, no, I thought they were going to do a special military operation. Where I was wrong in terms of the actual substance is I did not know how extensive the operation would be. Right. I think it's fair to classify it as an invasion now. And it's going to be extensive, which I should have known from the beginning that they wouldn't be able to just take the Donbass and leave it at that, right? That the U.S. wouldn't allow that to fly, that they would just keep provoking and, sending more troops and stuff to Ukraine. Like, the whole country needs to be demilitarized for Russia to achieve their strategic objectives, their strategic goals. Which I should have realized that from the beginning, but live and learn. Your geopolitical analysis gets better as you get older and experience more things. But my error was not knowing how extensive the military operation was going to be. All right, but I knew that Russia was amassing troops on the border of Ukraine, and I knew that NATO was amassing troops on the border of Russia. I didn't know as much about the war in the Donbass and the history of and what had been going on in the Euromaidan coup. But I knew that NATO was amassing troops on the border and that there was a chance Russian troops entered Ukraine. But definitely learned a lot about the historical development to that conflict since it began.
Looking at the stock markets, many took a beating as the news broke and as oil shot up past $100 a barrel. As far as politicians, most have been speaking out against Russia, but you've also seen a kind of politician that's trying to lay this at the feet of President Biden, who for the longest time has been saying this is going to happen, though he's been kind of mocked for saying so. For example, you had Tulsi Gabbard seeming to prep herself for a job interview with Russia Today, tweeting out, "This war and suffering could have easily been avoided if Biden admin/NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine becoming a member of NATO," which would mean you.
That's so true. That is such a good and true tweet. What? How is he going to attack Tulsi Gabbard? Oh, she's applying for Russia Today. Is she? Because she doesn't want NATO to push the Ukrainian people towards their death at gunpoint. She doesn't want the Ukrainian people to be pushed into the meat grinder of the Russian military by the U.S. Oh, she's a Putin propagandist.
U.S. NATO forces right on Russia's border, which one is clearly bullshit given Putin's, quote, justification for what's happening. We're trying to make Ukraine seem like a Nazi state, but also I think it's concerning when you have someone who served in Congress that's just kind of repeating Steve Bannon's and Russian propaganda groups' talking points. But for the
that is so concerning. That's so concerning. She's repeating talking points from think tanks. Yeah, nobody else in Washington does that. No, what's concerning to you, Phil, is that there's somebody in Washington pushing for peace. Someone in Washington who knows what's going on and who knows that Russia did have legitimate security concerns that the U.S. not only ignored, but continually provoked and infringed upon. How can you talk about this situation, talk about the lead up to the situation, and not talk about all the money, the millions and millions of dollars funneled into Ukraine by U.S.-backed NGOs during the Euromaidan protests that led to the overthrow of the government that Victoria Nuland admitted, and that a leaked phone call showed her planning, the next government and the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. Right? So you ignore that, and then you ignore the fact that Ukraine was amassing troops on Russia's border. They were making troops that were NATO interoperable, training them to be NATO interoperable, meaning any other NATO country in Europe could have aided those Ukrainian troops. They could have fought together against Russia. Essentially just making Ukraine an arm of NATO without actually adding them to NATO, because Russia had constantly said that's a red line. You add them to NATO and we're going to invade. So Russia continually warned the U.S., said, stop doing this, stop provoking us. We need to protect our national security. And the U.S. continually provoked them. But that's terrible to say, according to Philip DeFranco. It's terrible to point out the obvious truth, and you can't point out the actual military, economic, political developments that happened in Russia and happened in Ukraine in the lead up to the war.
For the most part, like I said, with other politicians, it seems like standing with Ukraine and condemnations of Russia has been kind of the status quo. Right? Shortly after hostilities started, President Joe Biden issued a statement calling the attack unprovoked.
Yeah, and maybe that's a sign that we shouldn't just support it uncritically, Phil. If everybody in the U.S. State Department and everybody in Washington is getting behind this thing all at once, it's probably a bad thing. So that told us pretty much nothing about Hassan Piker. Shout out to Phil for wasting our time as always. The scope of the SMO was increased because the U.S. gave them long-distance striking capabilities. Oh, interesting. That's not good. Thank you very much to Third Eye Destruction. There was also the U.S. gave Ukraine the go-ahead to launch drones into Russia. There's still, some people, a lot of arms of the U.S. State Department and NATO are just admitting this is a war between Russia and NATO, right? That's who's fighting this war. Ukraine is just being used as a proxy, similar to a lot of the Cold War conflicts. But there are some people admitting it and saying, this is an existential threat for the West and we need to win this war against Russia and blah, blah, blah. But there's still some people saying no. And Philip DeFranco is one of them. He says it's not a war between NATO and Russia. It's a war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia invaded the sovereign nation, the sovereign liberal democracy of Ukraine unprovokedly. And that's the only thing that led to this war. I don't even remember where I was going with that. Either way, interesting that the U.S. gave, I forgot, I totally lost my train of thought. Happens. But yes, the U.S., I was saying that some people still deny that it's a war between the U.S. and Russia. And then the U.S. is like, yeah, but you can use our drones to fire on Russian civilians and Russian industry and the Russian military within Russia's borders. And also a bunch of U.S. vets are going to go join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. I'm sure there's special operatives and U.S. intelligence ops in Ukraine, guaranteed. Thank you so much, Third Eye Destruction, for the super chat, for the third super chat of the day. You're killing it. Thank you, Duck Hash Brown, YouTube member and super chatter. Why does this guy sound like a meteorologist? The cadence on his mouthpiece is awful. Phil, yeah, he's terrible. It's hard to watch. And that guy actually got his start on YouTube. Like, he got his start in like 2007, just making vlogs in his basement, talking to people on YouTube. And now he's got that State Department funding, I guess. Got the big bucks coming in from the NGOs or the think tanks or whatever. So yeah, Phil is one of the worst, and that's why it makes me so mad when I get banned on TikTok for criticizing him, because the kids need to see criticism of his content that gets millions of views. Thank you, thank you. Thanks for the super chat, Duck Hash Browns. I think they openly admitted that the CIA was training people there and Elon joined in. Yeah, I believe you're right. And I mean, yeah, like the Elon was sent Starlink to Ukraine, right? So the means of communication for the Ukrainian military are coming from the West. They're coming from U.S. capitalists or the U.S. State Department. They're probably going to have U.S. officials communicating with Ukraine and giving them intel and training them and stuff. I mean, we'd be naive to not think that's happening. This is a really good video from Richard Medhurst. I'm actually going to run to the bathroom, but I'm going to play this video while I run to the bathroom because I've already seen it. I want to react to it a little bit.
We have a lot of work to do, my friends. We have so much work to do. Our society is sick. Our society is sick and brainwashed. Our society needs help. Our society is drowning. All we have is individualism and capitalism and consumerism and war and hate and anger and imperialism. This is not a society. This is not a civilization. This is the opposite. This is the opposite of civilization. You know, just because you got nice, you have a nice iPhone or you have a nice computer, or you got some nice kicks. You're fresh. That you doesn't mean that you have civilization, because the behavior is what matters the most, right? And it's not people's fault. It's not people's fault. It's the government's fault and the media's fault, who are one and the same. Corporations, media, government, intelligence agencies, one and the same. These people are sick. They're evil. They're brainwashing us. They're sending us to murder other people and then come back and murder ourselves. This is sick. They brainwash you into caring about Ukraine because it's a war between the United States and Russia. It's a proxy war. It's NATO against Russia. They've been trying to do this for ages. So they brainwash the people into caring. If you care about Ukraine, you wouldn't have the war. If you care about Ukraine, you wouldn't push Putin to explode. We keep hearing Putin is crazy. Putin, he's fucking nuts. He wants to revive the Soviet Empire. Then why the fuck do you give him a reason if he's so crazy? If he's on edge, if this guy is a lunatic, why do you go and provoke him? Don't tell me you didn't provoke him. Man, you were provoking Russia since before anyone heard of fucking Vladimir Putin. This guy's not the issue. There are rules in politics. There are rules in geopolitics and international relations. You cannot surround another country with your army and pretend that you're not doing anything. You are an aggressor. You are provoking them, right? When you have people standing outside at your gates, and you know that they don't like you, and this is an adversarial organization and has been for almost 100 years. That's called aggression. That's provoking the Russians. So if Putin is so crazy, why did you provoke him? Why do you give him a reason? If you care about Ukraine, you wouldn't do this. If you care about Ukraine, you would do diplomacy. You didn't do any diplomacy. These people, they just care about, let's make money. Let's send hundreds of billions to the weapons industry and pretend that this is caring for Ukraine. No, you don't care for Ukraine by sending Ukrainians to die and kill Russians and be killed by Russians and slaughter each other. That's not caring about Ukraine. If you care about Ukraine, you wouldn't have the fucking war in the first place. Do you understand this? They never tried diplomacy. They tried war and it doesn't work, right? Their strategy doesn't work.
I just really thought that was a good rant. It's so true. I mean, when he says they never tried diplomacy, Angela Merkel literally admitted. She literally said that the Minsk agreements, this original attempt at a peace deal that the US told us, or the media told us Russia broke up, that was a sham the whole time. That there were never any intentions of following the Minsk agreements, of going through with this. And that it was just a way to buy time and build up more NATO interoperable troops on Russia's border, build up Ukraine's military capacity, and eventually attack Russia. So they admitted that they never tried diplomacy, that it was always war, it was always death, it was always destruction that they were aiming at with Russia. And I mean, capitalism it creates a sick society, it creates a sick, individualistic, violent culture. It creates a culture of where all the most powerful people are these folks like Bill Kristol and Liz Cheney and David Frum and Max Boot, these folks who actively lied us into murderous interventions, actively committed mass slaughter on behalf of capital accumulation. And they're still the richest and most powerful people in our society. It's sick. It's the sick kind of culture that's created by a capitalist system that's been developing for too long. Its contradictions have just been developing to a sharper and sharper point. Yeah, and it's our mission to get people the truth. Big fan of Richard Medhurst there. I saw an interesting video the other day.
So many Ukrainians that are.
And it's also, like I said, you have these people with these Ukraine flags in their bio. People waving the Ukraine flag, and what they're supporting is pushing the Ukrainian people towards their death, pushing their people towards their death at gunpoint. It's like, this is how you support the Ukrainians. But the first tweet that I want to cover here is from Tucker Carlson. Well, it's actually from Noah, talking about Tucker Carlson, making a point about Tucker Carlson. If I can find it here. There it is. So this is very interesting here. Well, I'll read the original tweet, then I'll read Noah's to you. It says, after watching this video, you do realize Tucker could be fired for saying this. Given how he really feels, I'd say he's gone from Fox within a year. Or I'd say that he's gone from Fox within a year, meaning Fox is going to fire him within a year for the stuff he's saying. Seriously, if his heart is saying this, how can he stay in legacy media? And sorry, that's not what I meant to hit. And Noah responded and said, and here's what the left still doesn't get. Tucker Carlson is saying this. Tucker Carlson admitting he's been doing the bidding of Empire his entire life. And I've already heard it's an op. It's him opening his eyes. One of the most watched cable news shows in the world. Let's watch the video before I read any more of what.
But what if you're me and you spent your whole life in, like, I've spent my whole life in the media. My dad was in the media. Like, that is a big part of the revelation that's changed my life, is the media are part of the control apparatus. Like, there's no, yeah, I know, because you're younger and smarter and you're like, yeah. But what if you're me and you spent your whole life in that world, and to look around and all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow. Not only are they part of the problem, but I spent most of my life being part of the problem, defending the Iraq war. Like, I actually did that. Can you imagine if you did that?
What do you think? What is one of your biggest regrets in your career?
Oh, defending the Iraq war.
That is it?
Well, I've had a million regrets. Not being more skeptical, calling people names when I should have listened to what they were saying. Look, when someone makes a claim, there's only one question that's important at the very beginning, which is the claim true or not? So I say, you committed murder or you rigged the last election. Before you attack me as a crazy person for saying that, maybe you should explain whether you did it or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And for too long, I participated in the culture where I was like, anyone who thinks outside these pre-prescribed lanes is crazy, is a conspiracy theorist. And I just really regret that. I'm ashamed that I did that. And partly it was age, partly it was the world that I grew up in. So when you look at me and you're like, yeah, of course they're part of the means of control, I'm like, that's obvious to you because you're 28, but I just didn't see it at all. And I'm ashamed of that.
Isn't that what the media tries to do, though?
It's their only purpose.
Right.
They're not here to inform you, really. Even on the big things that really matter, like the economy and war and COVID and like things that really matter that will affect you. No, Their job is not to inform you. They are working for the small group of people who actually run the world. They're their servants. They're their Praetorian Guard. And we should treat them with maximum contempt because they have earned it.
So yeah, I don't, it's insane. It's like a mask off moment, like Unparalleled Dev is saying, to hear someone from, the most popular cable news show in the country. The host of that is saying that, is it mask off, or did he really have a change of heart? It seems like he really looked around the legacy media bubble that he had been in for years and was like, what is going on here? Right? Like the Trump MAGA movement sort of woke him up to the fake news that the media was, or that the media is, which then woke him up to things like the Iraq War, and woke him up to these imperialist interventions that the media helped lie us into, to the point where he says, the media isn't there to inform you. They're literally there to lie to you. They're there to get you to think a certain way, to benefit certain people's interests, corporations' interests. So it's just so interesting. And it's so interesting that he's the most watched cable news show in the country, because I always say this about Tucker. He's a lot smarter. For one, he's a lot smarter than his other Fox News hosts and pundits. But two, if you watch his show, it's much different from like Sean Hannity's show, right? Sean Hannity will just say whatever the establishment Republican talking point is right now. Like if Trump wears a tan suit, it's a good thing. If Obama wears a tan suit, it's a bad thing and it's a scandal. Whatever the Democrats are doing is bad. Whatever the Republicans are doing is good. That's Hannity. But that Tucker's not like that. If you watch Tucker's show, he'll be criticizing Amazon. He'll be criticizing big corporations. He'll be criticizing the war. He'll be criticizing establishment media, things like this. And I think it's so interesting that is the most popular news in the country, right? People know they're being lied to. They know that most of this stuff is fake news. Most of this establishment media is fake news. And they turn to, the most truthful thing they got, the best cable news outlet available to them, which sometimes, unfortunately, is Tucker Carlson, which shows how bad the legacy media is, the establishment media is. But people are desperate for an alternative, just like how our TikTok accounts blow up every time we make a new one, right? They can keep banning us, but people want that message. People are desperate for the truth, and people know they're being lied to. So I think that's why Tucker is so popular. And I agree with Noah. He says, and here's what the left still doesn't get. Tucker is saying this. He's been doing the bidding of empire forever. He's opening his eyes. Most watched cable news show in the country. And I've heard people say, but he's a rightist. Pay attention to what's changing. The notion that Tucker is admitting that he's been lying his entire career somehow means Tucker is now on our side, guys. He's saying that's not what he's saying. Right? This isn't saying that Tucker Carlson's a socialist. Tucker Carlson's a leftist. Although Glenn Greenwald said Tucker Carlson was a socialist a while back, which it's quite the stretch there, Glenn. But he's, a lot of people just say, oh, he's a right winger. He's on the other team. He's on the other side. Like, guys, that doesn't matter, right? Of course, he's a corporate media. He's an establishment media guy. He's not going to lead the working class revolution. But if he's opening his eyes and pulling the mask off of the establishment media from within it, that's very interesting to watch and very interesting to see, especially, if we're trying to make a Marxist analysis of the United States, of our country, and this is the most viewed cable media show in the country. Clearly, this person's important. He's speaking to a huge section of the American masses, right? It's worthwhile analyzing what he has to say and, assessing whether it's truthful. And I think it is. So very interesting. Very interesting how Trump and, the wake of Trump mania, how that has affected politics and the media and affected various people. Because I think that's what exposed it. Because a lot of Republicans just saw like some of the ways that the media was lying about Trump, like with Russiagate. And they're like, this is so obviously not true. This is so obviously a cooked up conspiracy theory that all these liberals believe because they don't like Trump. And then that opened their eyes to just how blatantly the media is willing to lie. how blatant the stories that they're just willing to straight up fabricate in order to get something done, like in order to give the Democrats a way to be anti-Trump without actually being pro-worker. Russiagate, and do anti-Russian propaganda. They were literally willing to just make up a story, pull a story out of their butts, and all the corporate media establishment outlets just beat on it as if it was true. Rachel Maddow covered Russiagate like every night, and people were like, "This is just Republican people, Trump people were like, this is just not right." And then that opened some of their eyes, opened the eyes of people like Tucker Carlson to how the media was lying about the wars, I think. If Trump goes on TV tomorrow and says he's a supporter of Antifa, the social democratic brainwashed masses will immediately believe Antifa is a Russian op. True. Trump is actually the king of Antifa. Check out this historian, Mr. Beat. Okay, I will at some point. You bet. When Eddie points out the facts and the more inside people say and call him a Russian propagandist, it's hilarious. I know. And that's the other problem with TikTok removing all of my accounts, is now there are videos of people who I responded to, right? They made a video about me and I responded to them. And usually, my response does pretty well. People are interested in that drama. Right. And whatever response I make defending myself, people want to see that argument. And those videos get a lot of traction. But they've all been removed now. They've been deleted along with the account. So now all you get on TikTok are videos of people making fun of me or people attacking me, and no videos of me defending myself because they've all been systematically removed. Brainwashing. Saw some more TikTok comment than Eddie's videos. Yes. Also, this tweet kind of blew up for us. Karl Marx is trending. We would like to take this chance to request that Joe Rogan allow our editor Eddie to come on his show and argue for Marxism in the free marketplace of ideas. We simply want to offer a new perspective on a topic that Joe has discussed on several occasions. So Joe Rogan's discussed Marxism plenty of times, right? And he admits that he's kind of a dum-dum. He's not like a big reader. He's not a scholar. But I study Marxism, and some have even said that I'm the Marxist Joe Rogan, right? So who better than to come on the Joe Rogan Experience and explain Marxism, argue for Marxism in the free marketplace of ideas than me? I can't think of anyone better. I can't think of anything I'd rather do. So everyone go like and respond to and retweet this tweet so I can get on Joe Rogan. I want to, one, have a push-up contest with him. 2, do a little bit of grappling. 3, maybe hunt some elk, and then, 4, do a podcast. If we only get around to doing the podcast, that's fine. But Joe, I'm a nice guy. I don't want to debate you or make you look stupid. I want to convince you that Marxism is rational, and it's a scientific view of history that will help us move society forward and progress society. It's not the evil, crazy thing that you think it is. Thank you, Joe Rogan. Sincerely, the communist Joe Rogan. I'm going to make a TikTok called Communist Joe Rogan challenges regular Joe Rogan to a debate. I'm writing that down right now. I love when a clickbait title hits me. Define Marxism, please. That would be difficult. Marxism is like a scientific view of history is the best way to describe it. It's scientific socialism, right? It's using the scientific method to make an analysis of capitalism and using the Hegelian dialectic, using that dialectic to try and make a material analysis of the world and of historical development, which finds that the history of every society is a history of class struggle. That struggle between different material and historically determined classes leads to the change in society, the collapse of one society and its replacement by another different kind of society. Happens through struggle between classes, like the French Revolution. You had this emerging bourgeois class who, alongside the peasant class, overthrew the church, the Catholic Church that owned a third of the land, the monarchs, the giant feudal landlords, and replaced the feudal system based on the divine right of kings with the capitalist system, based on the principles of liberal democracy and political democracy. So that's the simplest definition I can give of Marxism. Joe Rogan fakes open-minded conversations. They're all curated to support a shitty outlook. LOL. Not when I get on that show. I'll change his mind. I'll make him a Marxist. He'll rethink everything he ever said. I swear to God, I will. All right, one last story for today. Our buddy Elon Musk, and this goes along with what we were saying about the concentration of finance and tech capital and pharmaceutical capital, because there's just an absurd degree of concentration. And the stock market, Lenin talked about this in Imperialism, the stock market or the holding system, the fact that people can buy shares in industries pretty much all around the world has led to an increase in the concentration of capital, because folks like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who have a lot of money, can just buy majority shares, 50% of shares in whatever company they want, and then they can control the decisions for that company. So it makes their money, the stock system and the ability that banks provide capitalists to move their money around quickly leads to a massive increase in concentration of capital at the top. So in our current system, Elon Musk is one of the most wealthy, profitable, and successful exploiters, successful capitalists. And now he's talking about bringing back the company town. He wants to build a bunch of houses for his workers and own their houses and be their landlord as well as their employer. So it almost is like we're taking a step backwards to feudalism, and we're just going to have a bunch of lords owning the land and that we work for at all times. But these company towns are popular with natural monopolies in industries like mining. You had the Battle of Blair Mountain. That was based on a company town, mining company that owned the workers. Not only did they own their houses, and not only were they the workers' employers, but they also had like a company store, right? And you would get paid money that you could only spend at the company store. So you'd be buying stuff from the company. These were, like I said, popular in industries that are natural monopolies like mining, where one or two companies tend to control the whole thing, as well as in like plantations and mining, multinational corporations, the mining setups and the capital that they exported to Latin and Central America often turned into these like company towns, where like the United Fruit Company in Guatemala and other places would not only own the housing, but they would be the main employers, and they would own the store, and they would own all the healthcare services. And if they didn't think it was profitable for them to give you healthcare, they would just let you die. Che Guevara talks about this in his writings as he's touring Latin America in his motorcycle. But now Elon wants to bring these back. He thinks these company towns were a great idea and they need to return. He needs to run Tesla like Cuban sugar and tobacco plantations, or the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Jamaica, and other Latin American areas. Actually, Fidel kind of grew up on basically a company town or plantation that was owned by his father, Fidel Castro, or by his father, who had Fidel illegitimately as part of an affair. So maybe Elon just wants to create a new Fidel Castro by creating a company town and raising a bunch of kids in it. But so every economy is mixed, and the U.S. is basically, capitalism with a huge concentration of wealth and capital at the top, which almost makes it seem like elements of feudalism are returning. And it almost makes our capitalist economy start to look like a feudal economy dominated by a king or dominated by a lord. And this all comes from the concentration of real estate capital, industrial capital, banking capital into the hands of people like Elon Musk, who now has various different firms, various different companies he controls in various different industries, who have bought up like 6,000 square feet of land in this one area. At least 3,500, but other reports say as much as 6,000. It's hard to say because there are all these different companies that Musk has his hands in, that he owns shares in, and they're buying up land and basically trying to lay the basis, trying to set the stage to have this company town where all of the industries, all of the firms there are owned by Elon Musk. So a huge moneymaker for him and a huge way to accumulate for him. So yeah, this is just a product of, like I said, concentration, the stock market, which allows Elon to buy up all these different companies. And it shows what Elon Musk is, right? He's not a genius engineer. He's not a genius innovator. He's a speculator, right? He's someone who games the stock market, who is invested in all these different places on Wall Street. And he has majority shares in all these companies and uses those companies to try and expand his markets, try and set up an eternal market that only works for him, called a company town. That's all he is. He's not in the Tesla laboratory working on engines, working on spaceships, working on Minecraft cars. He's speculating, planning to build a company town, which, by the way, they want to call Snailbrook. It's 35 miles from Austin, Texas, and that's the name that he came up with, Snailbrook. It's like these people are literally supervillains. Like that's honestly the name that I would come up with if I was like trying to be a supervillain. We're gonna call it Snailbrook, and all the workers will work for me and buy from me and get healthcare from me. But essentially, the way Elon's pitching this is the way for the workers to pay less than market rates for rent, because they would be in a monopoly where all their rent is owned by Elon. So, a lot of times that drives employees away. The high cost of rent, the profits of the landlord class make it harder for industrial capitalists to get workers because people don't want to pay high rent. So this is a way for Elon to get around that while still collecting the rent money for himself and accumulating more and more. Like in Aspen, Colorado, by example, they have to give the teachers essentially free rent, free housing, because there are so many rich people who live there. The cost of housing is just through the roof. And they wouldn't really have any teachers for the kids if they didn't supply houses outside of the market. So that's part of the reason they're doing the company town, I'm sure, is because the rich have driven up housing costs in Austin. But this company town would surround Tesla's Gigafactory, right? They just went with all the supervillain names that they could, right? They're going to have this Snailberg or Snailville or whatever, Snailbrook, this town surrounding the Gigafactory. And all of the peons will live in the Gigafactory so they can maximize their time working for Elon. Giga. $700 million expansion coming soon to the Gigafactory. I'm sure Elon spends a lot of time in one of his many Gigafactories working on innovations and engineering. I'm sure he doesn't have a team of engineers who does that for him while he hangs out on a yacht and buys and sells stocks. So this town is planned to be so big, Snailbrook is planned to be so big that it would have to be incorporated, meaning recognized as its own city. It would have to hold elections for mayor. So Elon Musk would literally be able to create his own laws that his employees would have to follow, because this would be an incorporated town or an incorporated city. So he could control their laws. He could control the legal system that affects these people directly. It's literally feudalism. It's literally like being under a king. They also wanted to have their own school. And it was supposed to be a Montessori school, which is like this, individual sort of progressive form of school or education based on, allowing the kids' talents to flourish and, having individualized education. But if it's a school designed by Elon Musk, he's just going to breed up the next working class, right? He's going to breed up the next working class for the gigafactory right here in that town, right? The kids who are good with their hands and who aren't super brainy can get trained up by that school to be workers, factory workers, and the workers who are super brain, or the kids who are super brainy can, be trained into being engineers. You could just have that school do whatever the gigafactory needs it to do. So I doubt it's going to be a progressive school system if it's dominated by Elon Musk and his company town surrounding his gigafactory. And then in this article, it says that Elon discussed this plan with Kanye West and his ex-girlfriend Grimes. Like, actually, what world do we live in where our society is dominated by Elon Musk, who's trying to build a company town, and he's discussing this with Grimes and Kanye West? There are going to be people living in a town where the laws are made by Kanye, Grimes, and Elon Musk. Those are your mayors. Those are your bosses. Those are your landlords. There's going to be billboards and flat screen TVs of Kanye West and Grimes and Elon everywhere, just being weird. This is the future. This is that's the future America's headed towards. My first job after grad school was as a Big Four auditor, and it was at the height of the COVID shutdown, so I was always at work. This is worse than that. Thank you so much for another super chat, Duck Hash Browns, YouTube member and a major super chatter. Yeah, this is wild. This is definitely wild. Thank you for the super chat. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that story. But crazy. We were talking about the concentration of capital earlier. And if there's a crash, if like there is an actual collapse of the financial system, the government's going to bail out folks like Elon. They're going to bail out some of the wealthiest shareholders or wealthiest companies, actually, which in turn bails out those companies' shareholders. And they're going to bail out some big banks like they already have. And the working or living conditions for the working masses are going to continue to get worse. And that's going to be followed by a huge investment of capital, because what happens every time there's a crisis? Every time there's a crisis, it increases concentration, right? So all these smaller and medium firms go under. And then as the economy is rehabilitating, all these massive firms who just got a big bailout from the government reinvest. They invest in expanding their operations, which is what happened after 2008. And capital concentrated largely in Silicon Valley. It concentrated largely in the tech and pharmaceutical sectors, as well as banking, of course. But capital is concentrated to an absurd degree where these shareholder companies like Vanguard and BlackRock essentially have their hands in everything. They control every industry from agriculture to healthcare and all the different subdivisions of healthcare. As we talk about in the Journal of American Socialist Studies too, which you can get right now on Midwestern Marks. But there's been an insane level of concentration. If we go through another crisis, there's going to be another batch of concentration. Right? A huge batch or there's going to be a whole bunch of small, medium firms that go under and a massive investment of capital from the large firms who get bailed out. And conditions for the working masses will just get repeatedly worse as more and more money is transferred to shareholders on Wall Street and the big banks and the war effort in Ukraine, until eventually people get serious, people get organized, people rise up and put a stop to this BS, which is what we're here for, comrades. So make sure to join your local Communist Party, get involved with community and workplace organizing. Don't donate to the Democrats, don't support the Democrats. Become a Midwestern Marks Patreon instead, or patron instead. Yeah. I think I'll probably call it a day then, folks. Been going for almost 2 hours and 40 minutes, almost a 3-hour stream today, not quite. Thank you so much for tuning in and hanging out. As I mentioned a couple times, you can become a YouTube member and you get some emotes and some cool perks, as well as the Journal of American Socialist Studies. It's kind of like being a Twitch subscriber. So you can do that. Duck Hash Browns is an example of a YouTube member, which is why they have that little symbol next to their name, and which is why I give their comments priority when responding, because that's one of the perks that you get. The bailout scene from South Park used to be so funny. Now I'd welcome that method because that means the bailout isn't the only option. I need to watch that episode. I don't even know. I love South Park, but I don't even know what scene you're referencing. Dang, I'll have to check that out. Thanks, Duck Hash Browns. But anyways, can become a YouTube member if you want to support us. Patreon.com/MidwesternMarks is another one of the best ways to support us. Similar perks to YouTube on Patreon, like you get Journal of American Socialist Studies ebook for $10. Don't forget to resend me your email. Yeah, I got it, Jacob. And then there's the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which you can get on its own. Here's the ebook, issue 1 ebook for $5. Issue 2 is 10, paperback's 30. Yeah, we've tried to release issue 1 now for cheap because obviously these help fund our project, and we need these to support Midwestern Marks. Like, we need to have some content behind a paywall, but ultimately we just want to get the ideas out there, and we want y'all to have access to these essays we wrote. So this is $5. I could see another price decline in the future too. So, and patreon.com/MidwesternMarks. Look forward to Jacob's article being published for the Youth League here soon. Yeah, thank you all for hanging out. Thanks to the moderators. Much solidarity.